Hello, everyone. I am here to help you today to fall asleep. So before we get started, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know, where are you from and what time are you watching this? Now get comfortable and relax. Name of the story: The Shadow at the Playground. It was a quiet, warm evening when the shadows began to stretch longer than they should have, creeping across the cracked pavement of the old playground. The swings creaked softly in the breeze, and the jungle gym stood as a silent sentinel against the fading sun. A group of kids, no older than 12 or 13, hung out after school, their laughter and chatter filling the air. There was Emma, the boldest of the group, always taking the lead in whatever game they played. Then there was Matt, the quiet one, who often kept to himself but had a sharp eye for detail. Sam, a bit younger than the others, was the jokester, always trying to make everyone laugh. And finally Sophie, quiet, observant Sophie, who had a way of noticing things no one else did. They'd been at the playground nearly every day since they could remember, but tonight was different. It was Matt who noticed it first, as he swung higher and higher, the chain of the swing rattling with each push. His eyes caught a dark shape at the far corner of the playground, near the old slide. A shadow that seemed to move against the light, as if it were somehow separate from the rest of the darkness creeping in with the setting sun. "Did you see that?" Matt asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Emma, who had been laughing with Sam, turned to look, but the moment she did, the shadow was gone. She frowned. What are you talking about?" "I swear I saw something," Matt insisted, but when he glanced back, there was nothing there. Just the usual playground, empty, dark, and quiet. "You're just seeing things," Emma said with a roll of her eyes. "It's just the shadows playing tricks on you." Matt shrugged it off, but the feeling stuck with him. Something about the way that shadow had moved, as though it were watching him, made his skin crawl. The next day, they all met at the playground after school. It was routine by now, racing to the swings, daring each other to climb to the top of the jungle gym, playing games until the sun dipped behind the horizon. But as they made their way across the playground, Sophie's gaze fell on the spot near the old slide again. Her heart skipped a beat. There it was, the shadow. It was faint at first, just a shifting shape, but as the sun dipped lower, it became more defined. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it stood just at the edge of the slide as if waiting. "Do you see it?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't want to be the one to bring it up, but it was too strange to ignore. The others looked over, and for a moment there was nothing. Just the playground, empty and still. But as the wind picked up, the shadow seemed to grow longer, its form becoming clearer in the waning light. Emma's smile faltered. "What the hell is that?" Sophie's stomach twisted. "It's watching us." Matt took a step back, his eyes wide. "I swear it wasn't there earlier." Sam, trying to lighten the mood, joked, "Maybe it's a ghost." "Oohoo," he mocked, making spooky noises, but no one laughed. The air felt thick, heavy with something unexplainable. For a long time, no one moved. The shadow, if that's what it was, stood still, motionless, as though it were waiting for something. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, like there was something wrong about the way it stood there, just out of reach. "I think we should go home," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this." "No way!" Emma snapped, suddenly defensive. "I'm not letting some weird shadow scare me off. Let's just leave it alone." But it was Matt who spoke up, his voice quieter than the rest. It's following us." The group turned, their heads snapping to where Matt was looking. The shadow had shifted slightly, moving across the playground as they did, always staying just beyond their reach. It had no discernible shape, no features. It was just a deep, unnatural darkness that defied the fading light. Guys, Sam started, his voice shaky now, no longer joking. Maybe we should listen to Sophie. Before anyone could respond, the shadow moved again, this time faster. It stretched across the playground in a single, jerking motion, sliding past the swings and coming closer, its dark presence growing stronger. I don't like this, Matt said, stepping back. I don't want to be here anymore. But it was already too late. The shadow was now right in front of them. It didn't have a face, but they could all feel it, like a weight on their chests. The playground, once a place of joy, now felt like a trap. There was nowhere to run. The air was so still it felt suffocating. What is it? Sophie whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't know, Emma said, her bravado slipping. But it's like it's drawn to us. Like it wants something. A cold wind blew across the playground, and the shadow seemed to shift again, moving toward them. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, as if it had never been there. The group stood frozen for a long time, their eyes searching the playground, but the shadow was gone. They didn't say anything at first. None of them knew what to say. Finally, Sam broke the silence. Let's never come back here again. They all nodded, but no one could shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadow, whatever it was, had left them this time. But they knew deep down that it wouldn't be the last time they encountered it. It wasn't the end. It was just waiting. And the next time, it might not let them leave. The next few days felt different. The playground, once a familiar haven for the group, now seemed foreign, unnerving. They stayed away, choosing instead to meet at Matt's house or Sophie's, anything to avoid the shadow they'd seen. Yet the feeling lingered, like an uneasiness settling in their bones. It wasn't just the playground that had changed, it was them. They hadn't spoken much about what happened. It was too strange, too terrifying. But the silence between them was louder than any words they could have said. Matt tried to ignore it. He threw himself into his homework, distracting himself with video games and endless reruns of his favorite shows. But when night fell and the house grew quiet, that feeling would creep in. The same one he'd had on the playground, as though something was watching him, waiting. Sophie was the first to bring it up again. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and the group had gathered at her house. They sat in her living room, watching the rain beat against the windows, yet no one spoke. It was Sam who broke the silence. Why did it come after us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Sophie replied, staring at the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. But it was like it knew us, like it was waiting for something. That's what scares me, Matt added, his voice low. It wasn't just some random thing. It was different, like it was trying to communicate. Emma shook her head. Guys, let's just drop it. We saw something weird, okay? Let's move on. But Sophie, still staring at the window, spoke softly, almost to herself. What if it wasn't done with us? Everyone went silent at her words. What do you mean? Emma asked, a little too quickly. I mean, what if it's still out there? Sophie's voice trembled as she spoke, though she tried to sound calm. What if it's still watching us? A chill ran down Matt's spine. The others were quiet, but each of them felt it. The same gnawing dread that had filled them the night the shadow had appeared. They could no longer pretend it was just a bad memory. I don't think we can ignore it, Sophie continued. Not anymore. Stop. Emma shouted suddenly, standing up. We don't know what it is, and I'm not going to sit here and let it mess with my head. I'm done. We're done. But as she stormed out of the room, the others could feel it. There was something in the air. It felt thick, almost suffocating. The room seemed too quiet, too still. And then the lights flickered. Sophie was the first to notice. Did you see that? They all turned to look, but it was already over. The lights were back to normal, the soft hum of the ceiling fan returning to fill the silence. Just a power surge, Matt muttered, trying to dismiss the feeling that had crept up on him again. But Sophie didn't seem convinced. She was staring at the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" Sam asked, but Sophie didn't respond. She was too focused on something just out of their sight. A scraping sound, came from the hallway. It was soft at first, like fingernails dragging across wood. But as the seconds ticked by, the sound grew louder, closer. The others froze, their eyes darting toward the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Matt whispered, his voice shaky. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "It's back!" Before anyone could react, the lights flickered again, this time going completely dark. The room plunged into darkness. Their breaths were shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. Then came the sound, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and slow, each step echoing through the house as if someone, or something, was walking toward them. They were not alone. I don't want to look," Sam muttered, his voice barely audible in the pitch black. "I can't move," Emma said, her voice tight with fear. Sophie's hands were trembling, but she reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The small beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the hallway. For a brief moment, they all stood frozen, staring at the small circle of light, waiting for something to happen. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was heavy with tension. "Maybe it's just a power outage," Matt said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Sophie knew better. She had felt it, the same feeling they'd all felt at the playground, that feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond sight. She slowly turned the flashlight toward the hallway again, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space. No footsteps. No shadow. "Is it gone?" Sam whispered. "I don't know," Sophie replied, her voice barely audible. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't dare turn the light off. The silence stretched on, but it was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. Suddenly, the door to the basement creaked open. The air seemed to grow colder. And then the unmistakable voice came, a low, rasping whisper from the darkened stairwell. "It's here!" The voice echoed through the house, carrying an eerie undertone that sent chills down their spines. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, reverberating off the walls like it was alive, like it had a presence. They all froze, unable to move or speak. The flashlight in Sophie's hand wavered, the beam flickering weakly, as if the darkness itself was trying to swallow it. Who said that?" Sam managed to stutter, his voice breaking the silence. "I don't know," Sophie replied, her breath catching in her throat. She turned the flashlight toward the basement door, the small beam of light dancing erratically on the wall. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the silence like it was calling them closer. Sophie's heart raced. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here." But before anyone could move, the whispering returned, this time louder, more insistent, like a voice breaking through the veil of their fear. "Don't go!" The words were sharp, almost commanding, and with that, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound of the door closing sent all of them into a panic. Sam leaped backward, tripping over the coffee table. Emma's breath quickened, and she looked wildly around the room, as if searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. "Shit! We need to get out of here," Emma shouted, her voice shaking. But the door was blocked. The light in the hallway flickered back on, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward them. And then there was movement in the corner of the room, something shifting in the darkness. A shadow, taller than any of them, blacker than the night itself. It was moving, creeping toward them like it was alive, stretching and pulling at the edges of the room, as though it was hungry for something, someone. Sophie took a step backward, the flashlight beam jerking wildly in her hand as she tried to focus on it. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, clawed hands reaching toward them. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something that shouldn't be. "Get away from it!" Matt screamed, but his voice trembled with fear. He was too scared to move, too afraid of what might happen if he did. The shadow's presence seemed to grow stronger, pulling them closer. Sophie felt the temperature drop even further as the darkness pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. She could barely breathe, her chest tightening as the shadow continued to move toward them. It was as though it had a purpose, something it wanted from them. The flashlight in Sophie's hand flickered once more before it died completely, leaving them in the pitch black. "No!" Sophie screamed, her voice breaking. "We have to get out of here. Now!" But it was too late. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, strong enough to rattle the windows. The doors and windows slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The room was sealed off, and they were trapped with whatever that thing was in the dark. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the walls closing in around them. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to grow with every passing second. It was impossible to see anything, yet they all felt it, the cold, the weight of something watching them, something waiting. And then the whispering came again, louder than before. "Join us." Sophie's mind reeled. She could barely comprehend what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The thing in the shadows wanted them. It wanted them to stay. It was calling them to the darkness. "Run!" Sophie shouted, grabbing Sam's arm and pulling him toward the window. She had no idea how they were going to get out, but they had to try. But Sam didn't move. "Sophie, no," he whispered, his voice strained. I can't." Sophie turned to look at him, her heart skipping a beat. Sam's eyes were wide, and his face was pale, his pupils dilated in terror. He was standing frozen, staring at something in the darkness, something that wasn't there, but that he could see. "Sam, what are you?" But before she could finish, she heard it too, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, deep, and raspy. It was coming from behind them. Sophie spun around, her breath catching in her throat as she saw it. The figure. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form vague but solid. Its outline was blurred, shifting like smoke, but there was something undeniably real about it. Something that shouldn't be. "No," Sophie whispered, backing away slowly. "Please, no." The figure moved closer, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light. It reached out toward her with its long, clawed fingers, and Sophie's heart stopped. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. All she could do was stare as the figure came closer, its eyes fixed on her, as though it had been waiting for her. And then, just as it reached for her, a loud crash echoed through the house, the sound of the basement door slamming open. The shadow paused, its attention torn away from Sophie as something darker, something more terrifying, emerged from the basement. A figure, much larger, more menacing, emerged from the darkness, and the shadow retreated. The new figure was unlike anything Sophie had ever seen. It had no face, just a hollow void where its features should have been. Its body was twisted and contorted, as though it had been ripped apart and sewn back together. And as it stepped forward, the temperature dropped even further. The shadow had a master, and the master was here. The air in the room seemed to freeze, as if the very temperature of the space had been sucked away by the presence of the thing standing before them. Sophie's breath hitched, and she instinctively stepped back, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Her eyes were glued to the creature, unable to look away even as her mind screamed at her to run, to get out, to escape. But she couldn't. She was frozen in place, trapped in the suffocating grip of fear. The creature in front of her moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment, watching them squirm in their terror. Its form was shifting. Its body, like the shadow before, seemed to distort and warp, twisting in unnatural angles as it floated toward them. Its hollow face remained featureless, a black void where its eyes should have been. Yet, Sophie could feel its gaze, its presence penetrating her very soul. From behind her, she could hear the others, their panicked breaths quickening. Sam, who had been frozen in fear moments before, was now backing away slowly, his hands trembling at his sides. Emma was whispering frantic prayers under her breath, clutching the arm of the couch for support, and Matt, he was nowhere to be seen. Sophie turned quickly, searching the room in the faint, flickering light that still clung to the corners, but he was gone. "Matt!" Sophie called, her voice shaking with terror. There was no answer. Her heart leapt in her throat, panic rising within her as she spun around again. She couldn't afford to lose track of anyone. Not now. Not with whatever this thing was stalking them. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, echoed from the far corner of the room. The darkness itself seemed to be closing in on them, encroaching from all sides. The figure, its hollow face, now stood directly before them. Sophie's heart thudded in her chest, and she could feel the overwhelming weight of its gaze pressing down on her. It was like the air itself had thickened, making it difficult to breathe. What do you want?" Sophie managed to croak out, her voice barely more than a whisper. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it reached out with long, gnarled fingers, its limbs twisting at impossible angles as it grasped the air between them. Sophie's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but watch as the thing's skeletal hand hovered inches from her face. Then suddenly there was a loud crash from the kitchen, followed by the sound of someone, scrambling across the floor. A burst of frantic energy shot through Sophie, and she darted toward the noise without thinking, her legs moving before her mind could catch up. She didn't care what was happening. All that mattered was getting away from that thing. "Stay away from me," Sophie screamed as she ran, the sound of her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The room was dark, too dark to see anything clearly, but Sophie could hear the scrape of something dragging across the floor, closer, closer to her, relentless and horrifying. She pushed forward, her feet slipping on the wooden floor as she stumbled toward the kitchen. Her eyes desperately sought out any sign of the others. She had to find them. They couldn't be alone in this. And then she saw it, Matt. He was in the corner of the kitchen, his back pressed against the wall, his face ashen with fear. But something was wrong. His eyes were wide, fixed on something above Sophie's head, and his mouth moved as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. Before Sophie could react, the dark figure loomed in the doorway of the kitchen, casting a long shadow over the room. It was no longer just a shadow. The creature had taken on a more solid form, its limbs fully visible now, impossibly long and thin, twisted in unnatural angles. Its hands stretched out, gnarled and clawed, and its hollow face was staring directly at Matt. Sophie's breath hitched as she took a step backward, but then she felt something. A hand, a cold, skeletal hand, gripped her wrist tightly. She spun around to see a new figure emerging from the darkness behind her. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken deep into her face. Her skin was gray, mottled with bruises, as though she had been dead for a long time. Her mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, rotting teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Sophie recoiled in horror, trying to pull away from the woman's grip, but it was like trying to free herself from a vice. The woman's fingers tightened around her wrist, and Sophie could feel the cold seep into her bones. "Let go of me!" Sophie screamed, struggling to break free. But the woman just smiled, a grin that seemed to stretch far too wide, like a grotesque parody of happiness. "You're not leaving," the woman whispered, her voice low and hoarse, as though it had been pulled from the depths of some dark, forgotten place. And then, before Sophie could react, the creature's hand shot forward, gripping her throat with terrifying strength. It squeezed, its claws digging into her skin, its touch cold as ice. Sophie gasped for air, her vision swimming as darkness threatened to consume her. But then, just as everything started to fade, a loud, deafening crack rang through the room, the sound of something breaking apart. The creature's grip faltered, and Sophie fell to her knees, gasping for air as the pressure around her throat lifted. She could hear the others, Emma, Sam, screaming, their voices breaking through the fog of fear. The woman behind her disappeared, and the shadowy figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness. The room was silent, save for the sounds of their frantic breathing. And then, as quickly as it had all started, the room went completely still. Sophie sat on the cold, hard floor, gasping for breath, her hands trembling as they pressed against her neck where the creature's fingers had been. The room felt oppressive, as if the air itself was too thick to breathe. She looked around, half expecting to see the shadows creeping closer, to feel the heavy presence of something watching her from every corner. But there was nothing. The others were still huddled together, Emma clutching Sam's arm, both of them wide-eyed and shaking. They, too, seemed to be trying to make sense of what had just happened. The sounds of the apartment had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the group. No shadow moved, no sound came from the corners, and yet, they all felt the lingering presence of something malevolent, something that hadn't quite left. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered, his voice breaking the silence like a jagged shard of glass. Sophie wiped her eyes, trying to focus. She could still feel the coldness in her bones, the aftershock of terror lingering in her veins. I don't know, but it wasn't real. It couldn't have been." Emma shook her head, the words barely making it out of her mouth. "No, that thing, it felt real. It was real." Sophie glanced around at the apartment, trying to ground herself in the familiar surroundings of the living room. The dim light from the flickering bulbs above illuminated the space, but it only made the shadows seem deeper, more impenetrable. It was as though the darkness was waiting, just beyond the reach of the light. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, all felt like they were closing in on them. Every creak of the building, every flicker of light, felt like a threat. "We have to get out of here," Sophie said, her voice a mix of determination and fear. "This place isn't safe anymore. There's something in the walls." Sam nodded, his face pale. "I don't know how, but it's like something's pulling us in, drawing us back to this place. It's not over. How do we even know where it started?" Emma asked, fear dripping from her every word. "How do we stop it?" Sophie couldn't answer. She wanted to say something comforting, but the truth was she didn't know. She didn't know how to fight something like this. She didn't know how to make it stop. All she knew was that they had to leave before whatever had been haunting them came back for more. Without another word, they scrambled toward the door, hands trembling as they fumbled with the handle. But as Sophie twisted the knob, it didn't turn. She pulled harder, her palms slick with sweat, but it was stuck. Panic rose in her chest again, and she pulled again and again, but it didn't give. "It's locked," Sophie gasped. "Why the hell is it locked?" Sam tried too, but the door wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air thick and suffocating. The light overhead flickered again, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. It felt like the apartment itself was alive, pressing down on them, squeezing the life out of them. A sudden, sharp sound broke the oppressive silence, a loud thud, like something heavy being dropped from above. Emma yelped and jumped back, her back slamming into the wall. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a dragging noise, slow, deliberate, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Sophie turned to the others, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" she whispered. None of them had to ask. They all knew. The dragging sound continued, growing closer. Something, or someone, was moving toward them. The sound was coming from the hall, just beyond the living room. Sophie felt a chill crawl up her spine, and every instinct told her to run, to get away, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The walls were closing in, and whatever was coming was getting closer. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry. She stepped toward the source of the sound, her hand trembling as she reached for the hallway light switch. The room was silent except for the dragging noise, growing louder with each step. With a sudden, violent jerk, the lights above flickered and went out, plunging them all into complete darkness. Sophie froze, heart pounding. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. Whatever it was here. From the dark hallway, a figure emerged slowly, deliberately. Sophie could make out nothing, but she could feel the oppressive presence as it approached. It was tall, too tall, and its shape seemed to shift with the darkness itself. A soft hiss filled the air, like the sound of air being sucked out of the room, and the hairs on the back of Sophie's neck stood on end. "Sophie!" Sam's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a heavy weight of dread. We have to move. We have to get out of here. Now." But before Sophie could answer, the figure lunged at them with terrifying speed. A sharp, unnatural shriek pierced the air, and Sophie felt something cold and clammy wrap around her wrist. It squeezed, and she gasped in pain. "Help!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. She felt a tug on her arm, but it wasn't Sam or Emma. It wasn't even human. She couldn't even describe what she was feeling, something slick, smooth, like an unending, writhing mass. It dragged her backward toward the unknown. The darkness seemed to close in tighter, until Sophie couldn't see or breathe or think anymore. All that was left was the sound of her own frantic heartbeat, the cold grip around her wrist, and the eerie, maddening hiss of whatever had them now. Sophie's heart hammered against her chest as she was pulled, the grip tightening on her wrist like a vice. Her fingers dug into the floor, desperate for something to hold on to, but it was no use. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, leaving her unable to distinguish where the room ended and the void began. A cold dread settled deep in her bones, a sensation that this was only the beginning. Whatever this thing was, it had been waiting for them, and now it had them cornered. "Sophie!" Emma's voice broke through the haze of terror, her panic-stricken cry cutting through the air. But Sophie couldn't see her. All she could feel was the oppressive weight of the air around her, suffocating, drowning. With a violent jolt, Sophie was yanked forward, her body sliding across the cold floor. She could hear Emma and Sam's frantic shouts from behind her, but they were no longer close enough to help. The thing was dragging her through the pitch-black hallway, its cold touch sending shivers through her spine. It smelled of damp earth and rot, sickly sweet and decaying. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, the stench overwhelming her senses. "Help! Please help!" she screamed, her voice desperate, her fingers now slipping from the floor, unable to find any purchase. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the shadows moving like liquid as the thing pulled her further. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, shifting, closing in around her. And then, a sharp crack echoed through the hall, a sound so loud it nearly ruptured Sophie's eardrums. The pull on her wrist stopped, and she was suddenly left suspended in place, dangling in the dark like a rag doll. She strained to look around, but the darkness had consumed everything. The only sound was the thudding of her heart, now deafening in the stillness. A soft voice, almost a whisper, murmured from the shadows. "Not yet. Not yet." Sophie froze, the words sending a chill down her spine. She hadn't heard that voice before. It wasn't Emma. It wasn't Sam. This voice was hollow, distant, and layered with a strange echo that felt wrong, unnatural. "Who's there?" Sophie gasped, her voice cracking with fear. "What do you want from us?" The darkness stirred, the air thick with something unnatural. The voice came again, colder this time, tinged with malice. "I'm here, waiting." Sophie could feel her pulse quicken, a sense of dread swelling in her chest. The thing that had been dragging her through the hall was still there, somewhere in the abyss, watching, listening. Sophie's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a way to break free. But the air was thick with an energy she couldn't escape, and she could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her. Suddenly, the lights flickered, a brief flash of illumination that showed her surroundings just enough to see the cold, peeling walls and the long, dark hallway stretching ahead. The figure, if it could even be called that, loomed in the distance, its form shifting like smoke. She wanted to scream, but her voice faltered. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She had to fight. She had to get away. A figure materialized next to her, its face distorted, a blur of shifting shadows. Sophie gasped, recoiling in horror. The thing that had been pulling her, dragging her deeper into the darkness, was standing before her. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a featureless face, as if it had been carved from the shadows themselves. Its hands reached toward her, thin and long, its fingers like claws, but there was no sound as it moved. Only the oppressive silence, broken only by Sophie's ragged breaths. "Don't be afraid," the voice whispered again, this time from behind her. The words came from everywhere, yet nowhere at all. "It's all in your mind." Sophie closed her eyes, her mind racing. It wasn't real. She couldn't let it be real. She had to get back to Sam and Emma. They were close. They had to be. She had to hold on. But the darkness was pulling her, dragging her deeper into itself. "Help! Someone help!" she cried out again, louder this time, her voice echoing down the empty hall. But there was no answer. Just the hollow, mocking silence that seemed to consume every corner of the apartment. The figure before her moved closer, its long arms stretching toward her, the air growing colder with each step. Just when Sophie thought she couldn't take it anymore, the darkness parted, a sliver of light cutting through the suffocating blackness. She could see Sam and Emma now, standing at the end of the hall, their figures barely visible in the dim light. "Get out of here!" Sophie screamed, her voice raw, desperate. "It's coming!" But instead of moving toward her, they stood there, unmoving, their faces blank, empty. "No!" Sophie whispered, her throat tightening with fear. "No, no, no. Please, don't let it be." The darkness around her began to close in again, and the figure loomed closer, its fingers grazing her skin like ice. The whispering voice came again, louder now, and Sophie felt her consciousness slipping, her mind starting to unravel. She tried to fight it, tried to pull away, but her body refused to obey. And then everything went black. Sophie's mind swirled in darkness, her thoughts fragmented like pieces of a broken mirror. She couldn't tell if she was dreaming, or if this was some twisted reality she had been pulled into. The overwhelming silence was deafening, a void that crushed her chest with every breath. Her body felt weightless, like she was floating in a vast, empty space. A sharp gasp broke the silence, and Sophie's eyes snapped open. She was no longer in the hallway. The darkness around her had shifted, taking on a different shape, almost like a room. But it was a room that shouldn't exist, a room with walls that seemed to pulse and breathe, contracting and expanding like the chest of something alive. It was a place out of a nightmare, and Sophie could feel every inch of it gnawing at her. The figure was still there, lurking in the corners of the room, its dark form blending with the shadows. But this time, its presence was more oppressive, more solid. Sophie could feel it pressing against her, its presence suffocating her. She tried to move, to scream, but her body felt paralyzed, as if the very air around her had turned to lead, weighing her down. A voice, clear and sharp this time, rang out from the darkness. "It's too late." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see where it was coming from, but she felt it, the very air vibrating with the words. "No," she whispered, struggling to speak, but her voice barely escaped her lips. I won't let it end like this." The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter with each passing moment. She could feel the walls shifting, moving, as if the very space she was in was bending, twisting in unnatural ways. And then the figure stepped forward. Its presence was no longer just an unsettling shadow, but something tangible, something that exuded pure malice. Its shape was indistinct, ever-shifting, but its eyes, if they could even be called that, were holes, deep, hollow voids that sucked the light from everything around it. Sophie tried to scream, but the sound was choked in her throat, like the very air was refusing to let her. The figure reached out toward her, its fingers long and spindly, the tips like claws, groping toward her with an unnerving slowness. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. "Help," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, someone help." The figure's hand touched her shoulder, and an icy chill spread through her body, as though her very soul was freezing. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, as its touch burned through her, numbing her from the inside out. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, a loud crack shattered the air. Sophie's vision blurred as the darkness around her seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The figure reeled back, its form flickering, as though it was losing its hold on this twisted reality. For a moment, Sophie could breathe again, could move, could think. She didn't know how long she had, but it was the only chance she might get. With every ounce of strength, Sophie forced herself to her feet. The room felt unstable beneath her, the walls trembling as if the entire space was about to collapse. She didn't know where she was, or how she had gotten here, but the terror that had gripped her earlier had transformed into something else, an instinct to survive. The shadow, the thing, stayed back for a moment, its form flickering, but Sophie knew it was only a temporary respite. She had no idea how she could fight it, how she could escape, but she couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. With every ounce of courage, Sophie turned, sprinting toward the far end of the room. The walls were closing in around her, the darkness trying to reclaim her, but she didn't stop. She pushed forward, her breath ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. The shadows reached for her, but she refused to look back, forcing herself to focus on the only thing that mattered: escape. And then, just as her legs were about to give out, she saw it. A door. It wasn't much, just a sliver of light in the dark, but it was there. It was real. It was her chance. With everything she had left, Sophie hurled herself toward it. Her hand reached out, grasping for the handle, and just as her fingers brushed against it, a cold hand clamped down on her ankle, yanking her back with a force that threatened to tear her apart. Sophie screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness, her body being dragged back into the abyss. Sophie kicked and screamed, her foot thrashing desperately against the unseen grip that held her fast. Her heartbeat was deafening in her ears, and the coldness of the hand gripping her ankle seeped into her very bones. freezing her from the inside out. The darkness around her pulsed with malicious intent, as if the room itself was alive and it was hungry. With one final burst of energy, Sophie twisted her body, using the momentum to wrench her foot free. She fell forward, hitting the cold floor with a thud. Her hands scrambled across the smooth surface, searching for anything to hold on to, and her fingers brushed against the door's cold metal handle. She had no choice. She had to open it. Her hand wrapped around the handle, and with a sharp tug, she yanked it open. The door groaned in protest, but it gave way, opening into blinding light. Sophie didn't hesitate. She threw herself through the threshold, her body tumbling into the light and away from the suffocating darkness that had nearly claimed her. She was in a hallway. It was sterile, white, and bright, the kind of hallway that belonged in a hospital or an office building. But Sophie didn't care. She was alive. She was free. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and her chest burned with the effort of running. She stood in the hallway, trying to collect herself, her hands pressed against the wall for support. She had escaped. She had to have. But where was she? What was this place? And then she heard it, a soft scratching noise, almost like nails dragging across metal. Sophie's blood ran cold. She whipped her head around, but saw nothing. Only the blank, white walls stretching ahead of her, offering no answers. The sound grew louder, closer, more insistent. Scratching, dragging. A dark shape appeared at the end of the hallway, a flicker of movement that sent a fresh wave of panic through Sophie. She took a step back, her body trembling, and the scratching grew louder, now followed by a soft shuffle, like footsteps dragging themselves through the hall. The figure was closer now, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, far too tall for any human, and its body seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved toward her. Its face was hidden in darkness, a shadowy figure emerging from the light, its features twisted and misshapen. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. Her body refused to obey, paralyzed by fear. The figure paused, standing at the other end of the hallway, its head tilted unnaturally. A low, guttural voice emerged from it, whispering in a language Sophie didn't understand. Then it spoke again, clearer this time. "You're not safe." Her heart skipped a beat. The words echoed through her mind, crawling into her thoughts like worms. Sophie's pulse raced. She wasn't safe. It wasn't over. The figure lunged toward her, moving with terrifying speed. Sophie stumbled backward, her legs shaking beneath her, but she couldn't outrun it. Not in this hallway. Not in this place. She had to escape. She had to find another way out. Her eyes darted around, looking for anything that might give her a chance. A door. A window. A way out. But there was nothing. Just endless, sterile white walls. The figure was almost upon her now. Sophie's hand brushed against the wall beside her, and she felt something that wasn't part of the building. It was a handle hidden in the white paint. She seized it, yanking the door open with all her strength. It creaked and groaned, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell that seemed to lead downward into nothingness. But it was a way out. It had to be. Sophie didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the stairs, the sound of her footsteps pounding against the walls, mingling with the distant scratching that still echoed through the building. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself forward, each step taking her farther from the figure, farther from the horrors that had hunted her. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling downward into the darkness. And then, just as her strength began to wane, she saw it. Light. It flickered at the bottom of the stairs, a pale glow coming from an open door. Sophie's heart surged with hope. She had to reach it. She had to escape. With everything she had left, Sophie sprinted the last few steps, crashing through the door and into the light. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, locking with an almost final-sounding click. Sophie collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. She was in a new room, a small, dimly lit office. Papers were scattered across the desk, and the soft hum of a computer filled the silence. But it wasn't comforting. It was unsettling. She was still trapped, but at least she wasn't being pursued. Or was she? Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she lifted her head. Something was wrong. The air felt wrong. The silence felt wrong. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. Sophie froze. She wasn't alone. She wasn't alone at all. The figure stepped out from the darkness, its twisted form barely visible in the low light. It was the same figure from before, the one that had hunted her through the building. Its face was still obscured in shadow, but Sophie could feel its presence like a weight on her chest. It opened its mouth, and this time she understood the words it spoke. "You never escape. You belong here." And Sophie realized, with a heart-shattering clarity, that she was never meant to leave. The darkness swallowed her whole. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as the figure moved closer. Sophie's body trembled uncontrollably, a mixture of fear and a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread filling her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to push herself back, but her legs refused to move. "You belong here," the figure repeated, its voice low and gravelly, as if it had been through countless years of disuse. The words were heavy with finality. Sophie tried to scream, but the sound lodged in her throat, strangled by terror. She couldn't understand why she wasn't running, why she wasn't fighting back. It was as though the room itself had locked her in place, her limbs frozen in time, her mind trapped in the nightmare. The figure loomed over her now, its shadowy outline flickering in the dim light. Its features were still hidden, but Sophie could feel its eyes on her, cold, dead eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want?" A soft chuckle echoed through the room, sending shivers down her spine. "What I want," it said, "is for you to understand. You're not the first." Sophie's pulse quickened. Not the first? What did it mean? The figure's shape seemed to stretch and twist in the shadows, its form growing larger, almost as if the darkness itself were feeding it. Sophie could feel her vision swimming, her head growing heavy. The air was thick with the sense of something ancient, something malevolent. "I've waited so long," the figure murmured, and for the first time, Sophie noticed something in its voice, a sort of sadness. "But you're here now. You're mine now." Suddenly, a flicker of memory flashed in Sophie's mind, of her house, of the renovations, of the strange occurrences that had plagued her since moving in. The feeling of being watched, the way the walls seemed to hum with energy at night, the cold spots that always appeared in certain rooms. She thought back to the hidden spaces in the walls, the scratching sounds, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It all came flooding back, and she realized with sickening clarity that this figure, this creature, had been in the house long before she had ever stepped foot inside. It had been waiting, hiding, lurking in the darkness. And now that it had her, it wasn't going to let her go. She closed her eyes, tears welling up in her vision. It was no use. The nightmare had her. The figure was right, she belonged here now. But then, something strange happened. A loud bang echoed from somewhere behind her, followed by another. The walls trembled, and Sophie felt the floor beneath her shift, as if the very foundation of the building was being torn apart. The figure seemed to hesitate, its shadow flickering, momentarily unsure. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. She wasn't alone in this room anymore. From the darkness of the hallway, She could hear muffled voices, familiar voices like a dream. It was her friends, her family, all shouting her name. Sophie wanted to scream back, to call out to them, but her voice was still trapped in her throat. The figure before her growled, its form writhing with fury, but it couldn't stop them. They were coming. The door slammed open with a force that shook the room. Light flooded in, casting long shadows across the walls. The figure screeched, retreating back into the corner, its form shuddering and wriggling, as if it were melting into the very shadows. Sophie could feel its anger, its desperation, but it was fading, pushed back by the force of the light. "Get out of there!" "Sophie, where are you?" a voice cried. Her heart leapt in her chest. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but enough for her to hear herself. She couldn't believe it. It was her mother. The door flung open wider, and her mother's face appeared in the doorway, framed by the bright light outside. Her eyes widened as she saw Sophie, trembling on the floor, her face pale and drenched with sweat. She rushed toward her, her arms outstretched. "Sophie! Oh my God, I was so worried. Are you okay? What happened? What is this place?" Her mother's voice was frantic, but Sophie couldn't answer. She was too weak, too disoriented. She felt as though her mind had fractured into 1,000 pieces, all of them floating somewhere out of reach. Behind her mother, Sophie could see the shadows shift and retreat, the darkness swallowing itself up like a beast retreating into its lair. The figure was gone. For now. "Sophie," her mother said again, her voice shaking. "Come on, we need to get you out of here." With her mother's help, Sophie managed to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she forced herself to move, every step feeling like it took an eternity. They made their way out of the room, and Sophie could hear more voices now. Her father, her siblings, all calling for her, all rushing toward her. When they finally reached the front door of the house, her father pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "We're getting out of here," he said firmly. "This place isn't safe." Sophie looked back at the house, at the dark windows staring out at her like hollow eyes. She knew that it wasn't over. The creature might be gone for now, but it was still there, somewhere in the walls, waiting for its chance to return. But for now, at least, she was safe. They were leaving, and she wouldn't be alone anymore. As they walked away from the house, Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, each step taking her further from the nightmare that had consumed her for so long. The cool night air felt like a lifeline, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlights. Her mother walked beside her, her hand gripping Sophie's tightly, never letting go. Her father and siblings followed closely behind, their faces grim, their expressions hard to read. Sophie could hear her father murmuring softly to her mother, trying to comfort her, but Sophie couldn't focus on their words. The only thing that filled her mind was the image of that dark figure, the shadow that had haunted her every step since moving in. "What happened in there?" her father asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "What did you see?" Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She had seen so much, so many things that didn't make sense, so many pieces that didn't fit. How could she explain the terror, the feeling of being trapped in her own home, surrounded by walls that seemed to breathe with life? How could she explain the presence of the thing in the dark? It was there, she finally whispered, her voice cracking. The shadow. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. Her mother squeezed her hand. "We're going to figure this out," she said softly. "We'll get answers." But Sophie wasn't so sure. Part of her still felt as though she was walking through a dream, like any moment she might wake up and find herself back inside that cursed house, facing the darkness again. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see the house looming in the distance, its dark windows watching her, waiting for her to return. But there was nothing. The house was gone, just a shadow in the night. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Her eyes darted to the shadows that stretched out from the streetlights, but there was nothing there. Nothing but darkness. They reached the end of the street, where their car was parked. Sophie's father opened the door for her, and she slid into the back seat, feeling the cold leather beneath her. Her mother followed, sitting beside her, while her father got in the driver's seat and started the engine. As they pulled away from the house, Sophie stared out of the window, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The streetlights passed by in a blur, their flickering glow casting strange, shifting shadows along the road. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, to shake the feeling of being watched. But when she opened her eyes again, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection of the car window, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the end of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form barely visible in the darkness, but Sophie knew it was there. She could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Mom, Dad," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." Her parents turned to look out the window, but the figure was gone, swallowed up by the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. "What is it, Sophie?" her mother asked, her voice filled with concern. "What did you see?" Sophie didn't know how to explain it. It was like the figure had been waiting for them to leave, following them as they fled the house. She wasn't sure if it was the same shadow, the same creature, but she had the feeling that it wasn't over. It hadn't finished with her. It was still out there watching. Her father pressed his foot on the gas, urging the car to go faster. "We need to get away from here," he muttered. "This place is cursed." Sophie nodded, but the dread in her chest wouldn't go away. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see the shadow appear again, but it never did. The streets were empty, quiet, as if nothing had happened, as if everything was normal. But Sophie knew better. The nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. They drove for what felt like hours, the city streets blurring past them as they made their way to the safety of a hotel. Sophie tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure, standing in the shadows, waiting, always watching. When they finally arrived at the hotel, Sophie felt a brief sense of relief. It wasn't home, but it was away from the house, away from the darkness. They checked into a room, and Sophie immediately went to the bathroom to wash her face, hoping to clear her mind. But when she looked into the mirror, she froze. For a split second, she thought she saw something behind her, something standing in the corner of the bathroom, just out of sight. She whirled around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, dimly lit room. Her heart raced in her chest as she stared at the reflection of herself in the mirror. She looked the same, disheveled, tired, and pale, but there was something different in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Mom!" Sophie called out, her voice strained. "Dad!" Her mother knocked on the door. "Sophie? Are you okay in there?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She was too busy staring at her reflection, at the dark shadows forming in the corners of the bathroom, swirling in the corners of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house, the shadow, had followed her, that it was still there, waiting for the right moment to strike. She stepped away from the mirror, but as she did, she heard it. A soft whisper just behind her. "You're not safe," it said. Sophie spun around, but there was nothing there. The nightmare wasn't over, and she didn't know how much longer she could run. Sophie backed away slowly, her breathing shallow and rapid. The whispers seemed to linger in the air, wrapping around her like a cold, invisible thread. She reached for the door handle, desperate to leave the bathroom, to escape the suffocating sense of unease that had settled over her. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, and she yanked the door open, stumbling out into the dimly lit hotel room. Her mother was sitting on the bed, scrolling through her phone, while her father was pacing by the window, his brow furrowed in thought. Sophie's heart raced as she stumbled toward them, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Mom, Dad, it's here." It followed us. Her mother looked up from her phone, a puzzled expression crossing her face. "What do you mean, sweetheart? We're safe now, remember? We're away from the house." But Sophie could feel it. The air in the room had shifted. It wasn't the same. There was something wrong, something dark and suffocating that pressed in on her from all sides. "I heard it. It whispered to me," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father paused in his pacing, his eyes locking onto hers. "Whispered what?" Sophie swallowed hard, her mind racing as she tried to recall the words, the cold breath of the voice. "It said, 'You're not safe.'" Her mother frowned, shaking her head as if dismissing Sophie's fears. "Sweetheart, it was just a nightmare. You're probably still shaken up from everything that's happened. We're safe here. Just try to rest." But Sophie couldn't rest. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that would assure her that they were truly safe. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see the same figure standing outside, watching them from the shadows. But there was nothing, only the quiet city lights flickering in the distance. Her father sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe it would be best if we just get some sleep. We'll talk about this in the morning." Sophie nodded, but she knew that sleep wouldn't come. The darkness was still there, creeping in at the edges of her mind, waiting for her to let her guard down. The shadows were always watching, always waiting for the right moment. She didn't trust the hotel room, didn't trust the walls that surrounded her. Her eyes kept darting to the corners, to the mirror across the room, where she half expected to see something standing just behind her, lurking in the reflection. Her parents, exhausted and worn from the ordeal, eventually settled into bed. Her father turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness, and Sophie lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling. The quiet was oppressive. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, suffocating her. But then, the sound came, a soft scratching, like fingernails dragging across the wall. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She sat up quickly, straining to listen. There it was again, the faint scraping sound, growing louder, coming from the wall beside her. She froze, her body rigid with fear. Her eyes flicked to the window, but it was closed. No one could be outside. The scratching continued, relentless, as though something, or someone, was trying to break through the wall. Sophie's pulse raced, her mind a whirlwind of panic. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She needed to get out, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place. Then, with a loud bang, the noise stopped. Sophie's breath hitched, and for a moment, the silence seemed even worse than the scratching had been. She glanced over at her parents, both of them still asleep, unaware of the terror that had gripped her. But Sophie knew the truth. Whatever was happening, whatever was out there in the dark, was real. She slowly slid out of bed, her feet barely making a sound against the carpeted floor. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and every nerve in her body screamed at her to leave, to run. But she couldn't. She had to know what was causing the noise. Creeping toward the wall, she pressed her ear against it, holding her breath. The silence stretched out again, but this time, Sophie could feel something. Something watching her. She jerked away from the wall, her eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, just the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Sophie took a step back, then another. She didn't know what to do, where to go. The fear was paralyzing. She had to escape, but she couldn't move. She couldn't think. Suddenly, there was a soft click from the bathroom. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. Sophie spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered in her chest as she watched the bathroom door inch open. Something was inside. The darkness beyond the door seemed to stretch out, growing thicker, swallowing the faint light from the hallway. And then, just as suddenly as it had opened, the door slammed shut. Sophie's eyes widened in terror. She backed away from the bathroom, her eyes never leaving the door, her body trembling. She turned toward her parents, her voice a desperate whisper. "Mom! Dad!" Her mother stirred, but her father didn't move. Sophie shook them both awake, her hands gripping their shoulders. "Wake up! Something's in the room." Her mother's eyes snapped open, confusion quickly turning to concern. "Sophie, what's going on?" But before Sophie could respond, the door to the bathroom creaked open again. This time, it was not the door itself that terrified her. It was the figure that stood just beyond the threshold. Pale, motionless, it was almost invisible in the dark, save for the faint outline of its shape. The figure had no face, only an empty void where its features should have been. Her mother screamed, pulling Sophie away, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching them, and Sophie realized with chilling clarity that it had always been watching them. From the very beginning, the figure in the doorway didn't move, but the air around them grew heavy, thick with a palpable dread. Sophie's mother clung to her, pulling her toward the bed as if the simple act of retreating could protect them. Her father, now fully awake, stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the shadow in the bathroom. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something more, something they couldn't explain. Sophie's pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel the coldness of the room, the oppressive stillness, and the weight of the figure's gaze bearing down on them. It was like it was inside their minds, not just in the room. What is that?" Sophie's mother whispered, her voice shaking. Her father's jaw clenched. "Stay back," he muttered, almost to himself. He moved toward the bedside table where his phone lay, fumbling to unlock it, but his fingers were trembling. "I'm calling the police. This isn't normal." But the moment he lifted the phone to his ear, the lights flickered. The air seemed to thicken further, the temperature dropping, and the phone's screen went black, the call cut short before it even began. Sophie's father swore under his breath, glaring at the device in frustration, but there was no time to focus on that. The figure took a slow step forward, its motion unnaturally smooth, gliding rather than walking. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she instinctively pulled her mother closer to her, both of them shivering under the blanket, their wide eyes never leaving the figure. Her father stood still, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. It was as though the very room itself was suffocating them. The figure was closing in, and no one dared make a sound, afraid it might provoke whatever it was that now hovered in the doorway. Sophie's mother whispered urgently, "What do we do? What's happening?" The question hung in the air, but there was no answer. The answer, it seemed, was trapped in the unblinking, hollow eyes of the figure in the doorway. Eyes that weren't eyes at all, just empty voids. The air itself seemed to hum with a dark energy, the walls vibrating ever so slightly, as if the very foundations of the building were reacting to the presence. And then, as if the very force of her thought had summoned it, the figure moved. It didn't step forward. It simply appeared by Sophie's father's side, a sickening blur of motion that couldn't be fully processed by the human eye. One moment it was at the doorway, and the next it was next to him, standing too close, so close that Sophie could see the details, or lack thereof, in its face. A smooth expanse of skin, no features, just emptiness. "Dad!" Sophie cried, her voice rising in terror as she tried to pull him away. But he was already stiff, rigid as though the figure had a hold on him, controlling his every movement. Her father's mouth opened in an agonized sound, but it wasn't a sound Sophie recognized. It was a noise that didn't belong to him, an unnatural guttural wail, like something caught between two worlds. Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't her father. The man she had known all her life was gone, replaced by something wrong. In a desperate attempt, Sophie lunged forward, her hands grasping at the figure, pushing against it, but her fingers passed through the thing, as if it wasn't even solid. She staggered back, falling to the ground, her mother's screams filling the space between them. The figure's gaze, if it could be called a gaze, shifted toward her. The emptiness of its face seemed to grow, expanding, swallowing the last of her hope. It reached toward Sophie, its arms long and too thin, almost stretching in unnatural ways, its fingers too long, like claws, creeping toward her with terrifying slowness. Sophie scrambled backward, but her body felt numb, as if every movement required an immense effort. She could barely think. All she could feel was the cold, biting air around her, the dread rising in her throat, choking her. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone. Just like that, it disappeared into the dark void of the room. For a long moment, Sophie sat on the floor, gasping for breath, her mind reeling, unable to process what had just happened. Her mother clung to her, her arms trembling, eyes wide in shock. I don't understand," her mother whispered, her voice shaky. "What was that? What is it?" Sophie didn't have an answer. She could only stare at the empty space where the figure had been moments before. She could feel it lingering, like an aftertaste that wouldn't leave her mouth. But it wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with them yet. "Dad," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to look at her father. He was standing at the edge of the room now, staring straight ahead, his face blank and empty. The terror on his face had been replaced with something else, something that didn't belong. He was no longer her father. He was someone or something else. Sophie's mother slowly stood, her hands trembling. "We need to get out of here. Now." Sophie nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. There was no reasoning with the thing that had taken her father. It was beyond understanding, beyond their control. They made their way to the door, Sophie's mother leading the way. But the moment her hand touched the door handle, the lights flickered again. And then the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, growing impossibly long, filling the corners, moving like tendrils, twisting and curling in on themselves. The whispers began again. Soft at first, almost inaudible, but quickly growing louder, more insistent. "Leave, leave," the whispers hissed, a chorus of voices, each one more suffocating than the last. Sophie felt her mother's hand tighten around hers, but her grip wasn't strong enough. Sophie was already stepping forward toward the door. They had to leave. They had to escape. But as she reached for the handle, she felt a cold, icy pressure on her back. And when she turned around, her father was standing there again. But it wasn't him. It never had been. Sophie's heart stilled, her blood running cold. The figure that stood before her, once her father, was now a mere hollow semblance of him. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were voids of darkness, deeper than any shadow she had ever seen. His face, once warm and familiar, was now a twisted mask of emptiness, smooth and without expression, as if his very humanity had been erased. Sophie took a step back, a gasp escaping her lips, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from him. The silence was unbearable, and yet the air seemed to hum with a malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. Her mother stood behind her, frozen, too afraid to speak, too terrified to move. Her father, or what had once been her father, reached out a hand. It was slow, deliberate, as though testing the air, but the fingers stretched too long, too unnaturally. Sophie's breath hitched as the pale hand hovered just inches from her face, its touch colder than anything she had ever felt. "Sophie," the voice whispered. It wasn't her father's voice, but it carried the same cadence, the same tone. The sound was hollow, empty, like it came from somewhere far away. The voice didn't belong to him, yet it was still disturbingly familiar. "Sophie, please come back to me." The words were laced with a sadness, a desperate yearning that made Sophie's chest tighten. She could feel her knees weaken, as if the weight of his words was enough to crush her resolve. For a moment, she wanted to reach out, to believe that the man standing before her was still her father, that there was still hope. But then the smile came. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew, stretching unnaturally across his face. The once human features distorted, the edges of his mouth curling upward in a grin that was anything but comforting. It was wrong. It was terrifying. "No," Sophie whispered, shaking her head, taking another step back. "You're not him." The smile twisted further, and in that moment, the thing in front of her seemed to swell, growing larger, more imposing, as if it fed on her fear. The darkness in the room seemed to converge on it, feeding into its grotesque form. Her mother, still paralyzed with fear, whispered in a shaky voice, "Sophie, we have to go. It's not your father. It's something else." Sophie's eyes darted to the door. She could see it now, the light from the hallway spilling in, a sliver of hope that seemed miles away. Her feet moved before she could think, dragging her mother along as she rushed toward the exit. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the cold sweat clinging to her skin as she reached for the door handle. She almost had it, almost, but something icy and cold wrapped around her wrist, yanking her back. She screamed, but the sound was cut short as her mother, with an incredible burst of strength, tore her away, slamming the door behind them. The force of the slam rattled the walls, but it didn't seem to matter. They were out. The hallway was dark, eerily quiet, save for their ragged breathing and the distant sound of the storm outside. Sophie's mother didn't hesitate. She pulled Sophie down the hall, toward the stairwell. But as they passed the windows, Sophie caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. The figure was standing in the living room. It was watching them, its eyes, empty, soulless, locked with hers through the window. Sophie's stomach dropped. "It's following us," she whispered. Her mother didn't answer. She just pulled her faster, urging Sophie to keep moving. They reached the stairwell, but just as Sophie's hand touched the door, she froze. The whispers were back, faint at first, almost inaudible, but growing louder. The voices, all speaking in unison, whispered the same chilling words. "Run, run, run, run." Sophie's pulse quickened, her breathing shallow as she turned to her mother. "What's happening? What is it?" Her mother's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't seem to have an answer, but the grip on Sophie's hand tightened. "We need to get out. We need to leave this place." They burst through the stairwell door and began to descend, but the moment they stepped into the darkness below, something shifted in the air. The temperature plummeted. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching further than they should have. And then Sophie heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the stairwell above them. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned to her mother. "It's coming." Her mother's face was twisted in terror, but she said nothing. Instead, she urged Sophie faster, her steps now frantic as they reached the bottom of the stairs. But when they arrived at the door to the building's exit, it wouldn't open. Sophie yanked on the handle, but it was stuck. "No," she cried, tugging harder. Behind them, the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. The door was their only escape, but it refused to budge. Sophie slammed her shoulder against it, desperate, the sound of the footsteps now just feet away. And then, from the corner of her eye, Sophie saw it. The figure. It was standing in the hallway, just behind them, its eyes empty voids that seemed to consume the light. It stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, and Sophie could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. Sophie's heart raced as she turned to her mother, her hands trembling. "We're not getting out, are we?" Her mother, her face a mask of fear, shook her head. "No," she whispered. "We're not getting out. It's over." The figure took another step, and Sophie felt the air grow thick, choking her. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then everything went silent. Sophie's breath hitched in her throat as she realized the silence was suffocating, heavier than any sound she'd ever heard. The darkness around them seemed to pulse, a living thing, pressing in from all sides. Her skin crawled, every nerve alight with the sensation that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt like stone, her feet frozen in place. Her mother clung to her side, her face pale and gaunt, the same panic written in her eyes. The figure was still standing there, motionless, but Sophie could feel its presence even more strongly now, like it was inside her head, its influence curling into her thoughts. It was as though the figure had a hold on them both, not just physically but mentally, stripping them of their will to act. The faint whispering returned, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't words anymore, but an overwhelming force that seemed to echo inside her skull. Sophie shook her head, as if trying to clear the noise, but it only grew more intense. "Run!" It was a command now, and Sophie's chest tightened in response, but her body still refused to move. Her eyes never left the figure. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural energy, a crackling pressure that pulled at her insides. She could feel the weight of the unseen force, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. And then in the blink of an eye, the figure moved. It was a sudden shift, so quick that Sophie barely had time to process it. It was standing right in front of them now, too close, its dark, empty eyes locked onto hers. The smile, or what could only be described as a twisted parody of one, spread slowly across its face. The darkness of its form seemed to bleed into the space around it, filling every corner with cold. Sophie's legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her heart hammering in her chest. Her mother screamed, but it was muffled, as if the walls of the stairwell themselves were swallowing the sound. Everything felt wrong. The figure was not just a physical presence, it was something deeper, something rooted in a nightmare that had no end. And then, as if in response to her fear, Sophie felt a cold hand on her shoulder, ice-cold fingers that gripped her with a terrifying force. She turned her head slowly, afraid to look, but when she did, there was nothing there, nothing but darkness. The figure loomed closer, now standing above her. Its mouth opened wide, stretching impossibly, as though the fabric of its face was tearing apart. It was coming for them. There was no escape. Sophie's mother was sobbing now, her hands shaking as she tried to pull Sophie to her feet, but her body felt heavier than ever, as though gravity itself was pulling her down. Her eyes darted frantically from the figure to the door, but there was no way out. The door was sealed shut, the only exit barred by an insurmountable force. "Please," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible, the weight of the air pressing her words back into her throat. "Please let us go. We didn't mean to. We didn't mean to disturb you." But the figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Sophie's body shook with terror, and her mind spun with 1,000 frantic thoughts. "What is this? What do you want from us?" As though it could hear her, the figure's grin widened, its teeth sharp and jagged, unnatural. Its form flickered and warped, like smoke caught in a draft, and Sophie's stomach lurched. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. And yet, here it was. Her heart pounded, a rhythm now desperate and frantic as her thoughts scrambled for a way out, for anything to stop the thing from consuming them. She thought back to the journals, to the stories. Maybe there was something that could stop it. A memory flashed into her mind, a forgotten story her mother had told her when she was younger. Something about old legends, about spirits trapped in the walls, unable to leave unless they were released. Something about bargains. A bargain. Her voice shook as she forced the words out, her breath ragged. "We're sorry. We'll leave. Please, just let us go." For a long moment, the figure did not move. Its grin faltered, just for a second, and Sophie held her breath, hoping, praying, that it would listen. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a whisper in the very fabric of her mind, it spoke. "You can't leave." The words echoed in her skull, twisting, curling, suffocating her. It was not just a statement. It was a decree. The ground beneath her trembled, and suddenly, the darkness seemed to close in even tighter. The walls, the air, even the very floor around her felt alive, as though they were closing in on her, pushing her deeper into the void. The figure stepped closer, its form now a mass of swirling shadows, and Sophie couldn't move, couldn't think, as the grip on her soul tightened. Her breath caught in her throat, and the last thing she saw was the figure's face, smiling down at her, and then, darkness. Sophie woke with a start, gasping for air, her heart thumping painfully in her chest. She was on the floor of the stairwell, her mother shaking her, her face frantic with fear and relief. Sophie blinked, trying to focus, her mind reeling from the images that still flickered at the edges of her vision. The figure, was it real? Was it a dream? The darkness felt so tangible, like it had wrapped itself around her very being. "Sophie, you're okay," her mother whispered, voice shaking as she helped her sit up. Her mother looked frantic, her hands trembling, but there was no sign of the shadowy figure, no twisted smile, no looming terror. Just the sterile gray walls of the stairwell, bathed in the faint flicker of the emergency lights overhead. "What happened?" Sophie asked, her voice hoarse as she looked around. She was no longer in the grip of that suffocating darkness. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe, but the memories of what she'd seen and felt remained, clinging to her like a second skin. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. I don't know. One minute we were standing there, and then you collapsed. I heard you scream, and when I tried to reach for you, she stopped, her eyes darting around the empty stairwell. Something was wrong. I saw something. But now, she trailed off, looking at Sophie as if expecting her to explain. Sophie shook her head, still trying to piece together what had just happened. It felt like a nightmare, like the ground had shifted beneath them, and they'd been pulled into something else entirely. The way the figure had stared at her, its twisted smile, and the darkness, it had been real, hadn't it? But now, it was as if it had never existed at all. Maybe it was just a hallucination from the stress or the darkness, Sophie said quietly, though even as she said the words, she knew they didn't sit right with her. The feeling of that shadow, its eyes burrowing into her mind, felt so real, so tangible. It was a presence, something beyond her understanding, something that wasn't going to just go away. I don't know, but I felt it too. I felt it, watching us. Her mother nodded slowly, her face pale. I felt it too, but what was it? It couldn't have been real. Could it? She rubbed her eyes, trying to steady her shaking hands. This doesn't make any sense. Sophie stood, her legs weak beneath her. She had to get out of this place. She needed to be away from the stairwell, away from whatever was lurking there, waiting. Her thoughts were jumbled, but there was one thing that stood out above the rest, the feeling that they were not alone, that something had been watching them from the moment they stepped into this building. "Mom, we need to leave. We need to get out of here," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength as she looked toward the stairwell door. "This place is—" Before she could finish her sentence, a sharp noise cut through the silence. The creaking sound of the door at the top of the stairs. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving behind it. Sophie froze, her heart pounding in her ears as she exchanged a look with her mother. They were both still listening. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, like a footstep echoing from above. Sophie's pulse raced as the shadow of the stairs stretched in front of her, dark and empty. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Her mother nodded, her face pale. "Yes, but there's no one up there." Sophie didn't answer. She had to know. She had to see. She couldn't just stand there, frozen with fear. Slowly, she moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. "Don't open it, Sophie," her mother hissed, grabbing her arm. "We don't know what's up there." But Sophie's resolve was strong. "We'll never know unless we look." With a shaking hand, she twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The stairs before them were empty, the dim emergency lights casting long shadows on the walls. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's electrical system. Everything looked the same, still, quiet, but Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. The air felt heavier than it should, as though the building itself was holding its breath. She stepped cautiously onto the first step, her foot brushing the cold, worn metal. A chill ran down her spine. "Come on, Mom," Sophie said, her voice almost a whisper. She didn't know why she felt the need to be so quiet. It was as if something was listening, watching. Her mother hesitated, clearly reluctant, but followed nonetheless. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath their weight. The higher they went, the heavier the air became, thick and suffocating. It was like they were moving through a void, cut off from the world below. They reached the top of the staircase, and there, in the hallway beyond, Sophie felt a strange coldness, a presence that was more than just the temperature. The lights flickered overhead, and then they saw it. The door to apartment 309 was ajar, just slightly, enough for them to see inside. A sliver of darkness stretched out beyond the doorframe, and Sophie could almost swear she saw something moving inside. The air seemed to grow colder with every step they took, each one echoing through the empty hallway. "Sophie," her mother whispered, her voice barely audible. We shouldn't be here." But Sophie couldn't stop herself. She reached out for the door, her hand trembling as she pulled it open fully. Inside, the apartment was dark, a deep shadow that swallowed everything whole. But in the center of the room, something was there waiting. The figure. It was standing in the middle of the room, facing them. Its dark form stretched impossibly tall, a shadow cast against the wall. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her blood running cold. This time, it wasn't just an echo. This time it was real, and it was waiting for them. Sophie and her mother stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure in the room didn't move either. It simply stood there, watching them with its featureless, shifting form. It was a shape, an absence, something that defied understanding. The only thing that remained constant was its presence. It felt like a weight pressing on them, suffocating and relentless. Sophie's heart raced, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the darkness. There was something about the figure that was wrong. It wasn't just the shadows that twisted around it, or the way its form seemed to flicker like static on a television screen. It was the feeling of it, like it was an intrusion in this world, a thing that didn't belong here. But it had always been here, hadn't it? It had always been lurking just beyond their sight. Her mother's hand tightened around her arm, but Sophie barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on the figure, and she couldn't look away, even though every part of her screamed to run. The figure wasn't just watching them, it was waiting. The realization hit Sophie like a punch to the stomach, and her breath caught in her throat. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling. "What is that?" Her mother didn't answer. Instead, she took a step back, her hand shaking as she reached for Sophie's arm. "We need to go. Now." But before they could make a move, the door to the apartment slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Sophie and her mother both jumped back, their hearts leaping in their chests. The noise was deafening, echoing down the hallway, but the apartment was silent once again. A strange stillness had taken over the air, thick and oppressive. Sophie's mother grabbed her hand. "We can't stay here. We can't. Please, Sophie, let's go." But Sophie couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the door. The figure hadn't vanished. It was still there, somewhere beyond the door, lingering like a shadow in the dark. "Sophie," her mother pleaded again, pulling her back. But Sophie could barely hear her over the pounding of her heart. She was trapped, suffocating in this silent horror. Suddenly a soft, eerie voice filled the hallway, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was low, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but it reverberated through Sophie's bones. "Leave, before it's too late." The words were clear, chilling. And then, just as quickly as they had come, they vanished, leaving nothing but silence. Sophie's legs gave way beneath her, and she stumbled back, her knees hitting the floor. Her mother was still gripping her hand tightly, her face pale with fear, but Sophie's mind was spinning. The voice, "Leave before it's too late," was it a warning? Or was it part of the thing in the apartment, the figure that had been watching them? "Mom, we have to go. We can't stay here," Sophie said, the words coming out in a rush, panic flooding her chest. Her mother nodded vigorously, pulling her to her feet. "Yes, we're leaving. Now." But as they turned to leave, the door to the apartment creaked open again, just a fraction. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the dark space beyond. The shadow seemed to reach for them, its tendrils stretching out, as though it was calling them back. Without thinking, Sophie ran. She didn't look back, didn't care if her mother was still with her. She just needed to get out, away from the thing that was waiting for them in that apartment, away from the oppressive darkness that had followed them from the very beginning. She rounded the corner, breath coming in sharp gasps, her pulse thundering in her ears. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on forever. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to escape. She could feel her mother's hand on her arm, pulling her along, urging her forward, but Sophie was beyond reason. She was lost in the panic that had taken over her mind. And then, just as they reached the staircase, the lights flickered. For a moment, everything went dark. Sophie froze, the air around her thick with tension. She could feel her mother's grip tighten on her arm, her breath shallow and rapid. And then in the blackness, they heard it, the soft shuffle of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere behind them. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It was coming for them. Her mother's voice broke through the panic. "We have to keep moving. Don't stop. Don't look back." Sophie didn't need to be told twice. She ran, her legs burning as she bolted down the stairs, her mother at her heels. The footsteps were growing louder, closer, as though something was following them, its presence like a cold, suffocating mist that crept along the walls. She didn't know how long they ran, how many stairs they descended. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart and the rush of air, as she tried to outrun whatever was behind them. She couldn't think, couldn't stop to wonder what it was that was chasing them. She just had to get out. Finally, they reached the ground floor, the dim glow of the lobby lighting casting long shadows across the room. Sophie could see the exit doors ahead, a small sliver of safety. But just as they reached the door, the lights flickered once more. And then they went out completely. Darkness. Sophie's hand slammed against the door, and for a moment, nothing happened. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she frantically tried to push it open. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed behind her. She could hear her mother's voice, whispering her name, but it felt so distant. Everything was so far away, swallowed by the darkness. With one last desperate push, the door creaked open, and they were outside. The cool night air hit Sophie like a wave, and she stumbled forward into the street, her mother close behind. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Whatever was in that building, whatever was following them, it was still there, still watching, waiting for its next move. But for now they were free, and that was all that mattered. As Sophie and her mother stood in the street, gasping for breath, the world around them felt eerily still. The chaos of their frantic escape had left them disoriented, the dark, oppressive presence of the figure still lingering in their minds. The distant hum of the city seemed muffled, as if the night itself had drawn a blanket over everything. Sophie's legs trembled, and her heart still raced in her chest, the adrenaline refusing to dissipate. Her mother held onto her tightly, her face pale and drawn. "We're safe now," she whispered, but the uncertainty in her voice made it clear that neither of them believed the words. They were free, yes, but from what? They hadn't escaped the shadow, had they? Sophie's thoughts raced, spiraling into confusion and fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't outrun it, that it was still there, just beyond their reach. "What is happening?" Sophie's voice cracked, a fragile whisper in the night. "What was that thing? Why is it following us?" Her mother shook her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I don't know, Sophie. I don't know." The wind picked up, carrying a faint rustling noise, like whispers too soft to be understood. Sophie turned, her eyes darting nervously around the street, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows, but nothing moved. Then, in the distance, Sophie saw something, a figure standing beneath the dim glow of a streetlight. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to look away, but something held her gaze. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and cloaked in the same shadowy darkness that had haunted them in the building. Sophie could feel it again, the cold, suffocating presence, the sensation of being watched. "Mom," she whispered urgently, but her mother didn't seem to hear her. She was staring straight ahead, her hand still clutching Sophie's. Sophie's pulse quickened, her mind screaming to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its form melting into the shadows as if it were one with the night. Sophie's feet took a step backward, and then another, her instincts screaming at her to get away, to run as far as she could. But it was too late. The figure was moving toward them now, its presence growing stronger with each step. "Sophie," her mother's voice trembled as she pulled Sophie closer, her fingers digging into her skin. "We need to get out of here. Now." Sophie nodded, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She tried to pull away, to move, but the ground beneath her seemed to shift, like the world was bending and warping in response to the figure's presence. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching out as if they had a life of their own, pulling at Sophie, pulling at her mother. The figure was closer now, just a few feet away. Its face, or what passed for a face, was nothing more than a void, an absence of light, a hole where something should have been. Sophie could feel its gaze, cold and suffocating, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to go." But her mother didn't respond. She was frozen in place, staring at the figure, her body rigid, her breath shallow. Sophie turned back to her, panic rising in her chest. "Mom, we have to." Suddenly, the figure reached out, its long, shadowy fingers brushing against Sophie's arm. The touch was ice cold, like death itself, and Sophie screamed in terror. She jerked back, but the figure's grip tightened, pulling her closer. Her mother snapped out of her trance, her eyes wide with panic. "Sophie!" Without thinking, Sophie pushed against the figure, but it didn't move. It was like pressing against a wall of solid darkness. She could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, wrapping around her like a noose. The world blurred around her, her thoughts fractured and scattered, until all she could think of was getting away from the thing that was pulling her in. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure let go. Sophie stumbled backward, her heart racing, and she fell into her mother's arms. The figure was gone, disappeared into the night, leaving only the eerie silence behind. Her mother was shaking, holding Sophie tightly. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We have to get away from here." Sophie nodded, her body trembling. She could still feel the cold, the touch of the figure lingering on her skin. She wanted to scream, to run, but something held her back, a strange sense of dread rooted deep in her chest. The air around them felt heavier now, as if the darkness itself was closing in. Sophie looked around, but there was no sign of the figure. It was gone, but the feeling lingered. The sense that something was waiting, watching, waiting for them to let their guard down. With shaky breaths, Sophie and her mother turned and began to walk away from the street, away from the figure, away from the terror that had haunted them. But even as they moved, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly safe, that whatever had been chasing them, whatever had followed them out of that apartment, was still out there, still lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike again. And she couldn't help but wonder, would they ever truly escape? As Sophie and her mother walked down the street, the chill of the night air biting into their skin, they felt a strange sense of disconnection, as if the world around them had lost all its meaning. The familiar sounds of the city, the honking of distant cars, the murmur of far-off conversations, all seemed muffled, as though they were trapped in a bubble of silence. It was as if the night had swallowed everything, leaving them alone in an unfamiliar, desolate world. Sophie kept glancing over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. Every shadow, every flicker of light made her jump. The figure wasn't there anymore, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was. Her mind raced, replaying the image of the dark, faceless figure, how it had towered over them, how its presence had crushed the air from her lungs. She couldn't understand why it had let them go. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. "Sophie," her mother's voice was weak, a faint tremor in the words. "We're almost home. Just a little farther." Sophie nodded, though she wasn't sure where home even was anymore. She couldn't remember the last time she felt safe, the last time she felt secure. The walls of their apartment, the one they had been so eager to move into, now seemed like a trap. A place where something far older and darker had waited for them. A place where the past had come alive to drag them into its nightmares. They walked in silence for a few more minutes, the dark street stretching out before them like an endless, shadow-filled tunnel. But the farther they walked, the more Sophie began to notice something strange. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if something was pressing down on them from above. She felt like they were moving through water, slow and suffocating. She looked at her mother, who was now glancing around with a frantic urgency in her eyes. "Mom, Do you hear that? Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her mother stopped in her tracks, her face pale. What? What do you hear? Sophie strained her ears, listening. There was again the faintest of noises, like the tapping of something against metal. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded far away, yet impossibly close. It was the sound of something moving, following them. She spun around, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. Mom! Sophie's voice wavered with fear. Her mother grabbed her arm, her grip tight and desperate. We have to move. Now. They started walking faster, their footsteps echoing on the empty street, but the sound behind them only grew louder. The tapping, like nails against the pavement, began to quicken, faster now, almost as if something was running to catch up. Sophie's heart raced. She could feel it, feel the presence of something following them, closing in with every passing second. She glanced over her shoulder again. The street behind them was empty, but the tapping sound was unmistakable. It was as though the very ground beneath them was shifting, warping, as if the street itself were alive, and something, some dark force, was crawling out from the earth. Without warning, her mother pulled her into an alley, away from the street, hoping to find some shelter. Sophie's mind spun as she followed, her breath coming in short gasps. But when they reached the alley, they found it wasn't empty. The shadows seemed to gather there, pooling together like liquid darkness. Sophie's eyes widened. The walls of the alley stretched impossibly tall, closing in on them, and the shadows seemed to move, to breathe, swirling in unnatural patterns. Sophie could barely see in the dim light, but she could feel the oppressive weight of the darkness, thick and suffocating. Then she saw it. A figure, not the faceless shape from before, but something worse. It was crouching at the far end of the alley, just at the edge of the shadows, its body low to the ground. Sophie's blood ran cold as she recognized the shape. Humanoid but distorted, hunched over like some grotesque parody of a person. Its eyes were wide and gleaming, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. The figure didn't move, but it watched them, its gaze cold and unblinking. Sophie's mother gasped, a hand covering her mouth. She started backing away slowly, pulling Sophie with her. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, though the terror in her eyes told a different story. They both knew they couldn't outrun it. The thing had been following them the entire time. Sophie tried to look away, but her eyes were locked on the figure. The longer she stared at it, the more she could feel it, like it was inside her mind, crawling beneath her skin. She could feel its hunger, its malice. It wasn't just watching them. It was waiting for them to move, to make a mistake. Without warning, the figure stood unnaturally fast, its limbs jerking and cracking as it straightened. It let out a low, guttural sound, like a whisper, but not one that could be heard. It was a sound that came from deep inside Sophie's mind, like a thought that wasn't her own. Her mother started to run, pulling Sophie with her, but Sophie's feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey. The shadowy figure was closing in, the air growing colder with every passing second. Then something shifted. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She could hear a new sound now, above the whispering, above the tapping, the sound of footsteps, but they weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from behind her. "Sophie!" Sophie turned, and her mother was already running, but Sophie couldn't move. There was something else she had missed, something waiting in the alley behind her. And when she turned back, the figure was gone. But the footsteps kept coming, and she couldn't help but wonder if the shadow was already behind them. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to turn and run after her mother, who was now several feet ahead, her figure just barely visible in the dim alleyway. The heavy, unnatural silence that had hung in the air seemed to grow thicker, making it difficult to breathe, to think. Her feet felt like lead, dragging along the cold, wet pavement as she tried to push herself faster. But the footsteps continued. They echoed in time with her own, quickening with every step she took, and Sophie could feel them closing in, behind her, beside her, just out of her sight. She stole a glance behind her, half expecting to see the creature from before, its face contorted into a grotesque grin, but there was nothing. Just shadows, stretching longer and darker, as if the alley itself were consuming the light. The absence of the figure somehow made the fear in her chest even worse. Where had it gone? What had it been? Her mother's voice echoed from the front, distant but desperate. "Sophie, hurry." Sophie's legs burned with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop, couldn't look back, couldn't risk slowing down. They were almost out of the alley, almost to the street. Just a few more steps. But then, a crash. A loud, deafening sound, like metal striking metal, rang through the alleyway, and Sophie screamed, stumbling to the side. She looked up just in time to see a streetlight shudder and flicker before going out completely, leaving them in complete darkness. The only light now came from the distant street, but it felt impossibly far away. The alley had swallowed them whole. "Sophie!" Her mother's voice again, but this time it was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, and wrong. The air shifted, like the ground beneath their feet had become unsteady. Something was coming. Sophie felt a tug at her arm, and she was yanked forward, her mother's hand gripping her like a lifeline. They stumbled out of the alley and into the open street, the chill of the night air rushing in like a wave. But it didn't feel like freedom. Not anymore. It felt like stepping into a world where nothing made sense, where the rules no longer applied. Behind them, the sound of footsteps stopped. Sophie's mother slowed, and Sophie looked over at her, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide. "What's happening?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse. "Where did it go?" "I don't know," Sophie said, her voice trembling. She tried to steady herself, but the ground felt like it was shifting beneath her, the buildings on either side looming like dark, oppressive giants. It was then that Sophie realized something she hadn't fully understood until now. The night was wrong. It wasn't just the shadows or the strange noises. It was the way the world felt distorted, as if the streets, the buildings, the sky itself were bent, twisted. The city had become a maze of impossible angles, like a place out of a nightmare where nothing could be trusted, where everything was a reflection of some deeper, hidden truth. She looked up, scanning the street, the empty sidewalks that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Her mother was still holding her hand, her grip tight, but Sophie could see the confusion in her eyes too. And then, from the far end of the street, she saw it. The shadow. It was standing still at the edge of the light, just outside the glow of the street lamp. Not moving, just watching them. Its figure was tall, tall enough to make the street lamps seem small in comparison. But it was the eyes, those dark, empty pits, that sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. The shadow wasn't human. It wasn't anything she could understand. It was something else. Her mother gasped, the breath catching in her throat. Sophie felt her heart skip a beat as the shadow began to move, its form shifting, lengthening as it stretched toward them. "Run!" Sophie screamed, pulling at her mother's hand. They sprinted down the street, but it felt like the world itself was closing in. The buildings, the street, the pavement beneath them, all seemed to twist, to bend in on themselves. The path ahead was no longer straight, but curved, like the entire city had become a labyrinth, trapping them inside. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps as they turned a corner, her heart pounding in her chest. But when they looked back, the shadow was gone. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Sophie thought they were safe. She thought maybe they had escaped it, But then she heard it again, the tapping. The sound of something following them, just behind. It was getting louder, closer. She didn't need to look behind her this time. She could feel it, the dark presence closing in, and her blood ran cold. Her mother pulled her into an alley, the cold stone walls towering around them like tombstones. It was the only place left to hide, but Sophie knew it wouldn't be enough. It never was. The tapping stopped, and then silence. A silence so deep it felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Sophie held her breath, trying to listen, trying to sense anything that could help them. But it was like the world had paused, as if everything was waiting, watching, holding its breath. And then it came, a whisper. Soft at first, just a flicker at the edge of her mind, but then louder, clearer. "You're not safe." Sophie's heart stopped. She turned to her mother, but her mother's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with terror. And then, from the shadows, the figure stepped forward, its form emerging from the darkness like a nightmare made flesh. It was there, in the alley with them, its eyes fixed on Sophie and her mother. It was close now, too close. And this time, it wasn't just watching. This time, it was coming for them. Sophie's blood ran cold as she backed up against the brick wall, the texture of it digging into her skin like it was part of the earth itself, trapping her in place. Her mother was still beside her, but Sophie could feel the terror radiating from her as well. The whispering, the strange presence, it was unbearable. The figure in front of them was no longer just a shadow, but something tangible, something that seemed to distort the very air around it, bending light and color into an unnatural hue. Its face, if it could even be called that, was just a mass of darkness, featureless, but the coldness emanating from it was enough to freeze the marrow in Sophie's bones. "What is it?" Sophie gasped, her voice barely a whisper, but her mother's grip on her hand tightened, a futile attempt at comforting her, as though it could make the nightmare go away. I don't know," her mother stammered, her voice unsteady. "Stay close, Sophie. Don't look away." But Sophie couldn't tear her eyes away from it, couldn't ignore the suffocating dread that seemed to pour from the figure like thick, oppressive fog. She could feel the darkness closing in, could feel the weight of its presence pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if it was studying them, as if it were curious about their fear. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment, the terror it caused. Sophie could see faint outlines of what might have been its limbs, long and spindly, stretching unnaturally long in the flickering light from the street lamp above them. Then it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all, more like a thought invading her mind, a sound that wasn't heard with ears but felt deep inside her skull. "You shouldn't be here." Sophie's heart lurched. It wasn't speaking to her mother. It was speaking directly to her. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her legs wouldn't move. Her mouth was paralyzed by fear. Her mother seemed to snap out of her own fear-induced daze. She pulled Sophie toward her, her voice trembling as she tried to muster some strength. "We need to go. We can't stay here." But the moment she moved, the figure reacted. With a sudden, jerking movement, it lunged toward them, too fast for Sophie to comprehend. In the blink of an eye, the creature was mere inches from them, its shape now more defined, long black claws, a face devoid of any human resemblance, just pure darkness. Sophie screamed. The creature's fingers reached toward them, but before it could touch them, there was a sudden burst of light. A blinding flash that engulfed everything, so bright it seemed to cut through the darkness like a blade. The creature recoiled, its form distorting and flickering as if it were struggling to hold its shape. Sophie's mother grabbed her arm and yanked her forward, pushing her through the alley as quickly as possible. They didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to see if the figure had recovered or if it was still following them. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the pavement, the echo of their fear now the only sound in the night. Every step seemed to bring them further away from the nightmare, but the shadow lingered in Sophie's mind, its voice still echoing in her thoughts. They finally reached the street, the safety of the lights from nearby buildings surrounding them, and Sophie dared to look back. The alley was empty, no shadow, no figure, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Her mother pulled her into a nearby building, a convenience store that stayed open late, and slammed the door behind them. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, casting a harsh, sterile glow over everything. Sophie felt the tension in her shoulders loosen slightly, but her heart was still pounding in her chest, her mind racing. "Well, what was that?" Sophie gasped, trying to steady her breathing. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know. I don't know what it was. It felt wrong. Everything about it." Sophie looked at her mother, but she wasn't looking back. She was staring at something across the room, something just outside the reach of the harsh lights. The door to the store rattled suddenly, as if something was pressing against it, trying to get in. Sophie's mother took a step back, her eyes growing even wider, her voice barely a whisper. "It's still out there." Sophie couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. Her eyes darted around the store, her mind scrambling to find an explanation for what was happening. The windows were locked, the door was bolted, but the feeling of being hunted hadn't stopped. The silence that had fallen over the room was deafening. She could feel the weight of it pressing in on them. A flicker of movement in the corner of her vision caught her attention, and her gaze snapped to it. It was just a shadow at first, just a flicker of dark movement, like a figure in the corner of her mind trying to manifest. But then it grew. It stretched across the room, crawling along the walls like an insect, its shape taking form as it reached for them. Sophie's heart froze as the figure began to take shape, long, spindly limbs, a face devoid of features, just like the thing in the alley. Sophie backed away, but her mother grabbed her arm. "We can't outrun it," she whispered. "Then what do we do?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Her mother's face hardened, her expression suddenly determined. "We fight." Sophie didn't know how they could fight something like this, but she trusted her mother. She trusted her to keep them safe. Even if she didn't fully understand how they could possibly survive, she couldn't let this thing win. It was then that the creature stopped moving, its shadowy form still but watching them, its presence suffocating. Sophie could feel the air around them grow colder, the shadows in the room pressing closer, as if the world itself was closing in on them. Her mother took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice firm and clear as she spoke to the creature. "Leave us alone." The creature didn't respond, but Sophie could feel its anger, its hunger rising. It was waiting for something, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Sophie clenched her fists, her heart racing. She didn't know what to do, but her mother did. She was ready to protect her, and Sophie had to believe it would be enough. In that moment, she understood something. This wasn't just a creature that haunted the streets. This thing, whatever it was tied to something deeper, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them to find it. Sophie felt a strange pull inside her chest, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each breath. The air was thick, laden with an oppressive tension. Her mother stood firm in front of her, but Sophie could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Despite her mother's brave face, Sophie knew they were both trapped in something far beyond their understanding. The creature, if it could even be called that, remained still, watching them with a malevolent intensity. Sophie could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating her, and every instinct in her body screamed for them to run. But her mother's grip on her arm tightened, and she whispered, "We can't run, Sophie. We can't outrun it." The shadows in the room seemed to twitch, as if responding to her mother's words. Then the creature's form began to shift, the shadows pulsing and distorting around it. Its limbs lengthened, its face, if it could be called that, seemed to dissolve into a void of emptiness. Sophie could feel herself growing dizzy, the edges of her vision blurring as the thing drew closer. "Why is it doing this?" Sophie managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. She was terrified, her legs shaking beneath her. "What does it want?" Her mother's gaze didn't falter. "It feeds on fear," she said quietly. "It's always been here. It's tied to this place." Sophie's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the words. Tied to this place? Was it connected to the building, to the city? She had to know more. But before she could ask, the creature made its move. With a sudden, sickeningly swift motion, it lunged at them, its form blurring as it stretched impossibly long, its claws reaching out toward them. Sophie screamed, instinctively pulling her mother back, but her legs gave way, and they both tumbled to the floor. The world seemed to close in around them as the shadows enveloped them. Sophie's breathing was ragged, and her eyes stung with tears, but through the darkness, she could see something. A sliver of light, the fluorescent glow from the store's backroom, just barely visible through the encroaching shadows. "Sophie," her mother shouted, pulling her to her feet. "We have to get to the light." They stumbled toward the backroom, the creature's eerie whispers echoing around them, its presence vibrating the air like a low hum. As they neared the door, Sophie felt a cold hand brush her shoulder. She gasped, and in that moment, she knew it wasn't just the shadows they were running from. It was the creature itself. With everything she had left, Sophie pushed forward, tearing open the door to the back room. The blinding light spilled into the room, but the shadows didn't retreat. They pressed in, hungry for the light, as though it was a feast that had been denied to them for far too long. Her mother slammed the door behind them, locking it with trembling hands. They leaned against the wall, both gasping for breath, their hearts racing in their chests. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was their ragged breathing, and the ominous thudding against the door as the creature tried to push its way through. "It's not gone," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "It's still out there." Her mother nodded grimly, wiping the sweat from her brow. "We're safe for now. But it won't stop." Sophie didn't know how to feel. Fear was gnawing at her insides, but there was something else too, a strange, gnawing curiosity. The creature had known them. It had been watching them, waiting for them to discover it. But why? Before she could voice the question, her mother spoke again, her voice tight with something Sophie couldn't place. "It was never supposed to find us. But it did. We have to end this, Sophie. We have to stop it before it's too late." Sophie's mind raced. "Stop it? How? What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her mother took a deep breath, looking around the cramped back room as if searching for something. "There's a reason it's here," she said slowly, as if the words were weighing heavy on her. "A reason it's drawn to this place. It's not the first time." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Her mother's face was pale, her expression distant, as though she were lost in a memory. "When I was your age, I was here, in this city. The creature was already here. It's been haunting this place for years." Sophie's stomach turned as her mother continued. "My family tried to leave. We thought if we moved, we'd be safe. But it followed us. Always. I thought we were free, but it's been waiting for the right time." Sophie's mind reeled. Was her mother telling her that they'd been chased by this creature before? Had it been hunting her family all along? Her mother looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. We have to find a way to stop it, Sophie. The thing that's haunting this place, it's not just an ordinary creature. It's something older, something that has been living in the shadows, feeding on fear for generations. It's bound to this place. Sophie tried to make sense of the words, but everything felt like it was spinning out of control. There was so much she didn't understand, so much she needed to know. But before she could ask another question, the door began to rattle again. The creature was back. The door shuddered violently, the wood groaning under the pressure as if the creature outside was trying to break through. Sophie could hear its eerie whispers seeping through the cracks, a low, guttural sound that crawled under her skin. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively moved closer to her mother, who was already crouching near the corner of the room, her hand pressing against the wall as if she were trying to ground herself. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as if the shadows themselves were stretching further into the space. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced with thoughts, questions, about how they were supposed to survive this. What did her mother mean by stopping it? Was there really a way to end this nightmare? The door rattled again, louder this time, as though the creature had grown impatient. A sharp screeching sound filled the room, like claws scraping against metal. The creature was trying to claw its way inside. Sophie's mother spoke, her voice steady but filled with an edge of urgency. There's a way to stop it, but we have to act quickly. If we don't, it will find us again. We can't let it continue. Sophie's pulse raced. What do we have to do? What's the way? Her mother's gaze flicked to the back of the room, to a small, dusty cabinet near the far wall. It was barely visible in the dim light, but Sophie could see the faint outline of something that resembled a lock, a hidden mechanism that her mother must have noticed long ago. Over there, her mother whispered, pointing toward the cabinet. There's something inside, a way to weaken it, but we have to use it in the right moment, and we have to be prepared for what happens next. Sophie nodded, the fear in her chest mixing with a surge of adrenaline. She knew her mother was right. They couldn't just sit here and wait for the creature to break through. They had to fight back. They had to do something. Her mother moved first, slowly and cautiously. She crept toward the cabinet, her movements precise, as if she had done this before. Sophie followed her, the sound of the creature outside growing louder, its whispers more frantic, more desperate. Every inch of the room felt like it was closing in around them. As they reached the cabinet, her mother knelt down and began to work on the lock. It was old, rusted, and barely visible under the layer of dust that had accumulated over the years. Sophie held her breath, watching her mother's every move. The tension in the room was unbearable, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way, and the cabinet door creaked open. Inside, there was an assortment of old books, some dusty, some weathered with age. But what caught Sophie's attention was a small, worn leather pouch resting in the back of the cabinet. Her mother's fingers closed around it, and she pulled it out with a reverence that made Sophie's heart race. "This is it," her mother said softly, her voice shaking. "This is the key to ending it." Sophie's eyes widened. "What is it? What's inside?" Her mother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the pouch carefully, revealing a small, intricately carved stone. It was cold to the touch, and Sophie could feel the weight of it even from where she stood. There was something almost alive about the stone, as if it were pulsing with an energy all its own. "This," her mother whispered, holding the stone up to the light, "is a relic. It's been passed down through generations. My family, they've used it before. It weakens the creature, but it's not easy. You have to use it at the right moment. and you have to be prepared for what happens afterward. Sophie's mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. What do you mean, what happens afterward? What's going to happen? Her mother's eyes darkened, a shadow passing over her face. The creature is old, older than anything we can comprehend. Using this stone will hurt it, but it will also make it more dangerous. It will fight harder. It won't give up. And when it's over, we may not be the same. Sophie felt a cold chill run down her spine. The weight of her mother's words hung in the air, heavy with a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But there was no time to argue. The creature was still out there, still trying to break through the door. "We don't have a choice," Sophie said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother nodded, her face grim. "No, we don't." With a final glance at the stone, her mother handed it to Sophie. "It's your turn. You have to be the one to use it." Sophie took the stone from her mother's trembling hands, her heart pounding. The stone felt cold, heavy in her palm, and for a moment, she thought she could feel a pulse within it, like a heartbeat. It was as if the stone itself was alive, aware of the danger it was about to face. Together, they moved toward the door, and Sophie felt the creature's presence on the other side. It was waiting, patient, its hunger palpable. The whispers had become louder, more insistent, as if it knew they were preparing to fight back. Sophie's mother turned to her, her voice low and filled with urgency. "When you're ready, you have to throw it. Throw it into the shadows." Sophie nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the stone tighter. She could feel the weight of what she was about to do pressing on her shoulders. This was it. This was the only chance they had. With a deep breath, Sophie stepped forward, her feet carrying her toward the door. The creature's presence on the other side was suffocating, a black void that seemed to stretch endlessly. But Sophie had no choice. They had to end this. Her hand reached out toward the door handle, and as her fingers brushed the cold metal, she heard the whispers again. The creature's voice was clearer now, almost like a low growl, as if it was taunting her. "You can't stop me," it seemed to say. "You will never escape me." Sophie swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no intention of running anymore, no intention of backing down. She threw open the door. The shadows rushed in, swirling around them like a dark tide. And with everything she had, Sophie hurled the stone into the heart of the darkness. The moment it hit the floor, a deafening crack split the air. The shadows recoiled, screaming in agony, as the stone's power began to pulse, sending waves of light through the room. The creature howled, a sound that shook the very foundation of the building, its form flickering in and out of existence. The battle had begun, and Sophie knew it wasn't over yet. The creature's screech reverberated through the entire house, rattling the windows and making the floor tremble beneath their feet. Sophie could feel the stone's power filling the room, expanding like an unseen force. The shadows writhed in pain, recoiling from the light, but they quickly began to regain their form, more furious than before. Sophie and her mother backed away, their eyes wide with terror. The creature was still there, its presence growing stronger, more determined. Sophie could see it now, its shape flickering in and out of existence, a hulking mass of darkness with glowing eyes, slithering through the corners of the room like an ancient predator, stalking its prey. The stone pulsed again, and Sophie felt its energy surge. Her mother was muttering something under her breath, an incantation she had remembered from her family's old texts, something meant to hold the creature back. But Sophie could tell that it wasn't enough. The shadows were closing in around them once more. "We have to keep it at bay," her mother said, her voice strained. "The stone is weakening it, but only for a short time. We need to trap it." Sophie's mind raced. How were they supposed to trap something that could move like this? She looked around the room, her eyes falling on the corner where the old bookshelves stood. There had to be something, some sort of barrier, some way to contain it. And then she saw it. The cellar door. It was just barely visible in the darkness, but Sophie could make out the faint outline of the wooden door beneath the stairs. It was old, weathered, and mostly hidden behind a stack of boxes. But if they could get it open, if they could trap the creature inside... "Mom, the cellar!" Sophie cried, pointing toward the door. Her mother followed her gaze and nodded, a look of determination flashing across her face. "It's our only option." They didn't hesitate. Together, they ran toward the cellar door, the creature's shrieks growing louder, more desperate. Sophie could hear its claws scraping across the floor, its presence closing in from all directions. But the stone, still glowing with its ethereal light, held the shadows at bay, buying them just enough time. Her mother reached the door first, yanking it open with one swift motion. The dark stairwell beyond seemed to swallow the light from the room, but it was a place, an anchor. They had to get the creature inside. They had to trap it there. "Come on," her mother urged, her voice filled with urgency. "Get in." Sophie didn't hesitate. She darted into the cellar, her heart racing in her chest. The air was damp and thick with the smell of mildew, and the darkness was suffocating, but she didn't have time to think. Her mother followed her into the stairwell, slamming the cellar door shut behind them. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The oppressive darkness of the cellar pressed in around them, and Sophie could barely make out the shapes of old furniture and boxes stacked along the walls. But they were safe for now. "Did we trap it?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her mother didn't answer right away. She was crouched low, her hand on the ground, feeling the vibrations beneath her fingers. Sophie did the same, pressing her palm against the cold stone floor. And then she felt it, like a rumble, deep within the earth. The creature was still out there, thrashing against the walls of the house. "No," her mother said softly, her eyes wide with realization. "It's still here. It's just waiting." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She looked around the dimly lit cellar, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of their situation. They hadn't escaped. They had only delayed the inevitable. "Then what do we do?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's face hardened, her eyes glinting with something dark. "We have to finish it. We can't just trap it. We have to destroy it." Sophie didn't know if she could believe her. But the way her mother spoke, it was like she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. "The stone," Sophie said, looking at the small, glowing relic still clenched in her hand. "How does it destroy it?" Her mother's lips pressed together into a thin line, her expression grim. "I don't know, but I've heard of ways to use it, ways to burn it out of this world. But it will require all of us, every ounce of our strength. If we fail, we won't just lose ourselves. It'll follow us forever." Sophie felt the weight of her mother's words like a physical blow. Could they really end this nightmare? Could they truly destroy something so ancient, so powerful? And then she heard it. The sound of movement, of scraping claws against stone, was faint but unmistakable. The creature was moving again. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. There was no time left. "Mom, we have to try," she said, her voice shaking but determined. She held the stone out, feeling its pulse in her hand. Her mother nodded, standing and walking toward her, her face set in a mask of resolve. "We have no choice." Together, they raised the stone into the air. The air around them seemed to thicken, the shadows curling and writhing like snakes. Sophie felt the energy of the stone course through her, a raw power that burned through her veins like fire. The ground beneath them trembled again, the creature's presence looming closer, suffocating. It was waiting, ready to break free. And then, with everything she had, Sophie slammed the stone down onto the cold, hard floor. There was a deafening crack, louder than anything she had ever heard. The walls of the cellar shook, and the shadows screamed in agony, as if they were being ripped apart by an invisible force. Sophie felt herself lifted off the ground, her body trembling with the power of the stone's energy. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room fell silent. Sophie opened her eyes, not realizing she had closed them, and looked around. The cellar was still dark, but the air felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight was gone. The shadows had retreated. The creature was no longer there. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching them, waiting for the next opportunity. She glanced at her mother, who was standing beside her, her eyes closed in exhaustion. "Is it over?" Sophie asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Her mother didn't answer at first. She simply took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. "For now," she said quietly. "For now it's over." But Sophie knew. She knew this was only one battle in a war they had barely begun to understand. The creature might be gone, but the darkness was still out there, waiting. Sophie stood still for a moment, her heart racing in her chest as the quiet of the cellar settled around them. The weight in the air had lifted, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of her awareness, like a shadow on the edge of the light. She glanced at her mother, who was still standing, her hand resting against the stone wall for support, her breathing slow but labored. "I don't understand," Sophie said, her voice a shaky whisper. "If we trapped it, if we used the stone, why does it still feel wrong?" Her mother's expression softened, but there was a haunted look in her eyes. She turned and moved toward the stairs, her steps slow and deliberate. Sophie followed, instinctively gripping the stone tighter in her hand, as if its power might be the only thing keeping them safe. "We didn't just trap it, Sophie," her mother said quietly, her voice heavy with a mixture of regret and resignation. "We bound it to this place. To us. That's why the stone worked, but it's not a permanent solution. Not unless we finish what we started." Sophie froze halfway up the stairs. "What do you mean finish it?" she asked, her throat suddenly dry. The sense of dread that had lifted for a moment was now creeping back, slowly but steadily. She felt it, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. Her mother stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to face her, her eyes full of sorrow. "We have to destroy it. Completely. Every part of it. Or else, it will always be with us." Sophie didn't understand. "But we used the stone. You said." "It wasn't enough," her mother interrupted, her voice breaking. "The stone weakened it, yes, but there's more to it than that. It was always more than just a shadow, Sophie. You saw the way it moved, the way it hunted us. It's tied to something older, something deeper. This place, this house, has been its anchor for years." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. The shadows in the corner of her vision seemed to grow darker, as if they were closing in around her. The house felt alive, and not in a comforting way. She had always felt a sense of unease in their home, a feeling of being watched, but now it was something more, something she couldn't ignore. Her mother continued, her voice soft, almost as if speaking the words out of necessity rather than desire. "This house was built on land that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The creature, the shadow, it's tied to a curse. And that curse, Sophie, it's tied to us now. To you." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean it's tied to me?" Her mother's face was pale, and for the first time, Sophie noticed the deep lines under her eyes, the signs of exhaustion she had been too distracted to see before. "It was always going to be you. The stone wasn't just a tool, it was a key. And when you touched it, when you activated its power, you opened something. Something that was supposed to remain closed. Sophie felt the air grow thick, the walls pressing in on her. What is it? What's in this house? Her mother didn't answer right away. She stood, staring at the ground, her fists clenched. A long time ago, she began, her voice strained. There was a family here. They were the first to build on this land. And they had a child, just a little boy. He was taken, disappeared. And after that, the house was abandoned. No one wanted to live here. But the boy didn't stay gone. His soul, it lingered. Sophie felt her legs weaken, as if they were made of stone. She looked at her mother, who seemed so much older now, as if she had been carrying this weight for years. The creature, her mother whispered, is the boy. The shadow, it's his spirit, twisted by the curse. It was never meant to be freed, but now it's awake, and it won't stop until it has what it wants. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. What does it want? What does it want from us? Her mother's voice was barely audible, as if she were afraid to speak the words. It wants you, Sophie. It wants your soul. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The stone in her hand felt like it was burning, like it had a life of its own, urging her to do something. She looked down at it, the small object that had caused so much fear, so much confusion, and now so much darkness. But we can't just let it take me, Sophie said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. We have to stop it. Her mother nodded, her face filled with a sorrowful understanding. We will, but it won't be easy. The only way to truly destroy the curse is to make the ultimate sacrifice. Sophie's pulse quickened. What sacrifice? Her mother met her gaze. You. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sophie felt her stomach turn, as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She could barely comprehend what her mother was saying. I won't let it take you, Sophie, her mother said softly, reaching out and taking her hand. But the only way to end this is to break the cycle. You have to give up everything. Your connection to this place. Your life here. You have to become the anchor, just like the boy was. Sophie's mind raced. She understood what her mother was saying, but it didn't make sense. She couldn't be the one to end it all. She couldn't. Mom, no, Sophie gasped, shaking her head. I don't want to. Please, there has to be another way. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. I wish there were, Sophie. But this curse has taken so much already. We can't run from it anymore. We can't hide. We have to finish what was started. We have to end the darkness. Sophie felt her heart break, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest like a vice. She didn't want to make this choice, but the weight of the curse, the knowledge that the creature would never leave them alone unless this was done, crushed her spirit. You have to be strong, Sophie, her mother whispered, for both of us. Sophie closed her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't think clearly anymore, her thoughts clouded with fear and confusion. She didn't know if she could do this. She didn't know if she could end it all, end her own life. But she had to try, for her mother, for herself, for everyone the creature might haunt next. Sophie clutched the stone tightly, its warmth pulsing beneath her fingertips. She could feel its energy wrapping around her, filling her, pushing her to make the choice. And then, as the shadow in the house began to stir once again, Sophie took a deep breath, ready to face what she knew she had to do. She would end it, one way or another. Sophie stood there in the dim light of the hallway, the stone in her hand trembling slightly as the weight of her mother's words pressed upon her. The shadow, the boy's curse, was closing in, and it felt as though time was slipping away. The decision loomed in her mind like a dark storm, too overwhelming to fully comprehend, yet inescapable. Her mother's hand rested on her shoulder, the touch warm but heavy, grounding her in the moment. "You don't have to do this alone," her mother whispered. "We'll face it together." Sophie nodded, though the words felt hollow. How could they face something so ancient, so malevolent together? How could she willingly sacrifice herself for the sake of breaking a curse that had already taken so much? Yet, in the depths of her heart, she knew her mother was right. There was no other choice. The creature would not relent. It would not stop until it had its prize. Sophie's thoughts flickered back to the shadow, the flickering silhouette that had haunted the house ever since they moved in. At first, it had been little more than a strange feeling, a shifting in the corner of her eye. But now, it had become something far worse, an entity that felt almost alive, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. The house itself seemed to pulse with the curse, its old walls groaning, as if they were aware of what was coming. Even the air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as though the darkness itself was creeping into their lungs, filling them with dread. "I don't know if I can do this," Sophie said, her voice cracking. She was afraid, so afraid that the words she needed to say felt foreign to her. Her mother gave a small, sad smile, but her eyes were resolute. "I know you're scared. I am too. But we don't have a choice anymore." Sophie closed her eyes, her breath shaky. She could hear the wind howling outside now, a storm raging against the house, as if nature itself was rebelling against the decision she was about to make. Yet, the storm was nothing compared to the tempest inside her, the swirling tornado of emotions, fear, grief, confusion, that seemed ready to swallow her whole. But the stone in her hand seemed to calm her for a moment, its warmth spreading through her palm, steadying her thoughts. She remembered the sensation when she had first touched it, how it had surged with energy, how it had thrummed with the promise of something powerful. And now, it was her only hope. The stone could destroy the curse, could bind the shadow to the past. But the price was steep. "I won't leave you," Sophie's mother said, squeezing her shoulder. "We'll do this together, no matter what happens." Sophie opened her eyes, meeting her mother's gaze. She didn't want to do this, didn't want to give up the life she'd known, the future that stretched ahead of her. But she also knew that the darkness would never leave her alone. It would never stop hunting her, and it would never stop growing until it had consumed everything she loved. The house creaked around them, as though it was aware of the gravity of the moment. Sophie's heart thundered in her chest as she turned toward the cellar door. The creature was down there, waiting, lurking in the shadows. They couldn't avoid it any longer. Together, they descended into the basement once more. The air grew colder as they reached the bottom, the stone walls of the cellar closing in around them. Sophie felt as though the house was pressing in on her, its ancient bones groaning in anticipation. She could almost hear the shadow's whispers, its faint murmurs growing louder, as if it knew they were coming for it. Her mother moved toward the center of the room, where the sigils were drawn on the floor, the ones they had used before to bind the creature. But this time, the sigils felt different. They felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the curse had grown stronger in the time since they had first attempted to trap it. Sophie took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the stone in her hand. She could feel the power of it, ancient and untamed, surging through her, but it was different now, more intense. She knew that what she was about to do would change everything. "Are you ready?" her mother asked, her voice barely audible in the heavy silence of the basement. Sophie nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her heart. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she had no other choice. Together, they knelt by the sigils, the stone resting in the center of the pattern. Sophie closed her eyes, focusing on the power within her, on the stone that pulsed with ancient energy. She could hear the shadow moving in the distance, feel its presence drawing closer, its hunger palpable. The words her mother had spoken echoed in her mind. The sacrifice. The final step. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she whispered the words she had hoped she would never have to speak. I give myself to the stone. I give myself to the curse. Her mother placed her hand on Sophie's, her grip tight and steady. We are bound to this place, to the curse, but we will end it. We will end it together. With those final words, Sophie's hand pressed the stone into the sigil on the floor. There was a flash of light, blinding and bright, as the energy surged from the stone, coursing through her body and the room, shaking the very foundation of the house. The shadows in the room began to writhe, twisting and thrashing violently. Sophie felt the presence of the creature closing in on them, felt its hunger, its rage. It was almost there, so close she could taste it, could feel it clawing at the edges of her mind. And then, with a final deafening crack, the stone shattered, its light flashing bright enough to blind them both. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. The house seemed to hold its breath. And then it was over. The shadows faded. The oppressive weight in the room lifted. The house was silent. Sophie opened her eyes, her breath shallow and ragged. She looked around the room, her heart racing in her chest. The cellar was empty, the sigils now only faint traces of what had once been. Her mother was beside her, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. They were safe, but as Sophie stood, she felt the faintest tug in the air. A whisper, a movement, as if something was still there. Something that had never truly left. And for the first time, Sophie knew that some shadows never truly fade. Sophie stood frozen, her hand still on the ground where the sigil had been, her breath slow and labored as the silence in the cellar deepened. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end, a sensation she couldn't shake, even as the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to lift. Her mother's voice cut through the stillness, shaking and unsure. "Sophie?" Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, her eyes darted around the cellar, her gaze searching the dark corners, the once shadowed places where the creature had lurked. There was nothing now. No movement. No whispering voices. The room felt still, peaceful even. But then came that pull, that subtle, insidious tug in the air. Sophie's eyes widened, and she slowly turned to her mother, fear creeping up her spine. "Mom, I don't think it's gone." Her mother's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The shadow, it's gone. The house, it feels different. Lighter. No more whispers." But Sophie could feel it. A presence lingering in the corners of the room, as if something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was there, just beneath the surface. Just behind the veil of normalcy they were beginning to believe in. The house creaked around them, an old and tired groan, as if it, too, was uncertain of its own fate. Sophie looked up toward the stairs leading out of the cellar, the dim light of the house just beyond. There, at the top of the stairs, stood something. A figure, tall and dark, silhouetted against the fading light of the evening. It was a shadow of a figure, too large to be any person she knew. Her breath caught in her throat as her mother noticed the same thing. "What?" Her voice trembled. Sophie didn't wait for her mother to finish her sentence. She grabbed her hand tightly, pulling her away from the sigils, urging her up the stairs. They couldn't stay here. Not with that presence looming above them. With a burst of adrenaline, Sophie and her mother fled from the cellar, rushing up the stairs. They didn't dare look back, their feet pounding on the wooden steps as they made their way through the dark hallway of the house. But the shadow followed. Sophie could hear it, the low whispering, the faint shuffle of its presence, its every step a cold breath on her neck. The house had fallen eerily silent, save for the sound of their frantic footsteps, but she could feel it, a growing weight, pulling her down, dragging her towards something unseen. They reached the living room, but the front door was still locked. They needed to get out. The house seemed to be closing in on them, the walls narrowing, the corners darkening. And then the lights flickered once more. The house was no longer just empty. It was alive, and the shadow was a part of it. "Mom!" Sophie screamed. "We have to leave, now." Her mother nodded, her face pale, her movements sharp as she raced for the door, but the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and Sophie could feel her breath freezing in the air. A cold, unnatural chill that seeped into her skin and made her bones ache. Then, just as her mother reached for the door handle, the shadow appeared again, this time blocking their only way out. It loomed tall, impossibly tall, its form an indistinct, shifting mass that seemed to bleed into the shadows around it. It was no longer just a shadow, it was something more, something alive, and it had come to claim them both. Sophie's heart pounded as she stumbled backward. "No! No, please!" The shadow seemed to stretch toward them, its presence more suffocating with each passing second. And then, through the darkness, Sophie heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Too late," the voice whispered, its tone cold and final. "You cannot escape." Sophie turned to her mother, but her eyes widened in shock. The doorway had disappeared. The walls had closed in behind them. There was no way out. The house had trapped them. The shadow moved closer, its shape shifting, flickering between solid form and ethereal mist. Sophie could feel it tugging at her very essence, as if it were drawing her soul into the very fabric of the house. "No!" she screamed, desperate, clawing at the air as if she could tear it apart. She reached for her mother, but the figure in the doorway was too powerful, too unyielding. Her mother's eyes were wide with terror, her mouth silent, unable to speak the fear that gripped her heart. The shadow surged forward, and Sophie braced herself for what was to come. Her whole body trembled, her chest tight as though it would collapse from the weight of the curse's pull. She felt herself being drawn toward it, toward its darkness. But just as it was about to envelop them both, the stone in Sophie's hand, the one that had been their last hope, began to hum once more. The faint, barely perceptible vibration sent a jolt of energy through her body, as though the stone itself were alive, fighting back against the shadow. Sophie clutched the stone tightly, her fingers wrapping around it until they bled. A surge of power shot through her, and she felt something crack inside her chest, something deep and ancient that had been lying dormant. The curse, the shadow, the entity that had haunted her family, was not just a curse. It was a tether, bound to her and to the house, to everything that had come before. She whispered a single word, one that was barely more than a breath, but it was enough. "End!" The room trembled, the house groaning as the stone began to shine with an unnatural light. The shadow shrieked, its form flickering violently, but it couldn't escape the pull of the stone's power. The walls around them cracked, splintered under the pressure of the energy. Sophie felt herself being pulled toward the light, the house around her tearing apart, crumbling under the force of the stone's magic. And just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The house was silent. The air, once cold and heavy, was now still, and the shadow was gone. Sophie collapsed to the ground, the stone falling from her hand, its glow fading to nothing. Her breath was shallow, her heart still pounding in her chest as she looked around the room, now empty and still. She had done it. She had ended it. But as she sat there in the wreckage of the house, the remnants of the shadow still lingered in the air, whispers that would never truly fade. And though she was free from the curse, Sophie knew one thing with certainty. Some shadows never die. The last remnants of light faded, leaving the playground draped in an unsettling darkness. The air grew still, as if the very earth beneath them was holding its breath. The children stood frozen, their eyes wide with both terror and fascination. The shadowy figure in the distance had grown even taller, its form more defined now, almost solid, with an outline that shimmered slightly, as if made of smoke or mist. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook with a low rumble, a distant noise like a heavy sigh. For a split second, the shadow appeared to flicker, its edges curling and bending, as though it was losing its grip on the world. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back into focus, and the figure took a step toward them. "Run!" Ava shouted, her voice cracking as she turned and bolted toward the nearby streetlight. Her feet pounded the pavement as she raced, her heart thudding in her chest, urging her forward. Behind her, she could hear the others following, their feet scrambling to keep up. But as they reached the streetlight, a chilling realization hit them all at once. The shadow wasn't just following them. It was everywhere. The playground was no longer just a place of childhood laughter and games. It had become a distorted, warped reflection of their fears, the swings creaking ominously, the merry-go-round spinning on its own, the laughter of unseen children echoing through the air. And then, amidst the chaos, came a voice that no one could place, but that filled their heads with dread. "You can run, but you can't hide." The voice was smooth, too smooth, like honey dripping from the walls of their minds. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come to life. The children stopped running, too terrified to move, too frozen by the weight of the voice that seemed to fill every corner of their minds. And as they turned to face the playground once again, they saw it. The shadow was no longer just a figure in the distance. It was standing right in front of them now. Its eyes were empty, black voids, but they could feel its gaze burning into them. The children could feel its presence, heavy, suffocating, as though the world itself had tilted, and they were now standing on the edge of an abyss. But then, in a flash of clarity, Ava understood. The shadow wasn't just a creature. It was a memory of all the fear, all the anger, all the pain that had once lived in this place, buried under layers of time and neglect. It was a reflection of everything the playground had been, everything it had witnessed. And now it had come to life, looking for a way out. Without thinking, Ava grabbed the others by the arm and pulled them into the middle of the playground, away from the looming figure. "We have to break the curse," she whispered. "It's not real. It's just a memory. We can stop it." The children nodded, their fear mingling with determination. Together, they took a step toward the shadow, their collective will focused on driving it back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The figure hissed, a sound like wind through dry leaves, but it didn't move. It stood there, watching them with those empty eyes, waiting for them to make their next move. Ava stepped forward, slowly but steadily. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "We won't let you control us." The others joined her, standing side by side, their faces determined. And with that, they all spoke in unison, their voices louder than they had ever been before, as if calling on all the power of their shared courage. "Go back to the darkness. You don't belong here anymore." The shadow shrieked, a terrible, bone-chilling sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. For a moment, the world around them shimmered, the playground distorting as the figure writhed, as though it were being pulled back into the depths of the earth. The children held their ground, their voices unwavering, until finally, with one last, desperate scream, the shadow vanished. The playground was still once more. The wind whispered through the trees, the night air cool and calm. The eerie presence that had haunted them was gone, but the children knew that the memory would linger. It had always been there, and it would always be there, just waiting in the shadows. They stood in silence for a moment, catching their breath, before turning toward the street. Ava looked at her friends, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly, but deep down she knew the truth. The playground, and all the dark memories it held, would never truly be gone. It would always be there, just beyond the edge of the light, always waiting, and no matter how far they ran, the shadow would always be watching.